so curious. It's pathetic. With shepherding. Evaporated. I'm saying that.
Yeah. You're leaving in December also?
That's what they tell me. I've been on here a few months, couple months. Flynn, were you able to read that? Talk about it.
More explanation from you.
Still trying to figure out how we address soul. I guess would be the bottom line. That's.
There's no reason why Soul couldn't be done as a
I
condominium.
agree.
Yeah.
But then when I look at the condominium.
Hello?
We needed the same chart in the condominium. Between buildings.
Yeah. What we might do. We'll want to go into our multifamily development. And that's what we might do. The separation between the units.
Yeah, the whole. What a condo lot
We found there's a lot more issues that we didn't. Our attorney.
At last, I'm calling the Wednesday, October 3rd special meeting of the Planning Commission to order. Can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Hirschbein.
Present.
Commissioner Maruzzi. Here. Commissioner Woods. Here. Vice Chair Kellerstein.
Present and here.
Chair Wormick.
Present.
Commissioner Donenfeld and Hudson are both excused. We have a quorum.
Thank you. May I have a report on the posting of the agenda, please?
Madam Chair, the agenda was posted on Thursday, September 27th. This meeting has been noticed and posted in accordance with state law.
In terms of the acceptance of the agenda, I've had a request from staff to move item 2B to the front. So it would be 2B, 2A, 2C, and 3A. Can I have a motion to accept the agenda?
So moved.
A second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Public comments. The time has been set aside for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on consent calendar and other agenda items and items of general interest within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Planning Commission. Please note that the Planning Commission is prohibited from taking action on items not listed on the posted agenda. 3 minutes are allowed for each speaker. Members who would like to comment on items 1A and 3A are directed to speak now. That's the consent calendar and the discussion of the proposed small lot residential zone. So if you want to speak on those items, please come forward, or you may speak on the 3 public hearing items either now or when the public hearing opens. Thank you. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak? There being no members who've come forward, the public hearing is closed. We're going to go to the approval items. On the consent calendar, there is one item, which is the approval of the minutes of July 25th, 2018. It was a study session.
Move approval.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That passes. And since we have the voting system now, please also vote.
This is on the agenda?
Yeah, yes. This is on the the approval of the minutes,
I mean the minutes, okay.
consent calendar.
Actually, it's not what it says.
That passes unanimously. Item 2B, the City of Palm Springs for a zone text amendment to establish a citywide ordinance for the transfer of density. Staff report, please.
Yes, Madam Chair and Planning Commissioners. The item before you is for a new ordinance for the zoning code. If approved, it would establish the new section 93.23.18 of the zoning code. And what it is regarding is the transfer of development rights. So as a bit of background on the transfer of development ordinance, the city back in the 2000s, the mid-2000s, had a long history of preservation of mountain areas, which is all kind of described in your staff report. We established in 2006 the environmentally sensitive area specific plan zone with respect to the Chino Cone areas, and including 9 planning areas within that, the Chino Cone and Snow Creek areas. So that ordinance currently has limitations on development and what could be developed. There's also stipulations that allow for a transfer of development rights bonus, whether within the area or outside of those areas. However, the ordinance does not stipulate how transfer of development rights would occur. So what we have before you is an ordinance that could address this issue. When we're looking at the general plan that was established in 2007, there's provisions in there that discuss the transfer of development rights for open space and density. So there is provisions and policies in the general plan that discuss that. In general, the preservation of open space is one of the goals that the general plan supports. So when looking at the different types of open space that the general plan defines, we have conservation areas, desert areas, mountain areas, parks and recreation, and water, as well as the special policy areas that are defined as the Chino Cone and Palm Hills area. So as you see in the slide on the screen here, you have the various densities that those different designations permit. And so there is a variety of density that could occur within these open space areas. So in order to protect these areas and preserve these open spaces, the transfer of development rights ordinance is a mechanism in order to do that. So when we look at, for instance, the open space mountain designation, this designation, because there is such a large amount of area within the city boundary that it extends beyond the core developed area, this is primarily the largest of the open space designations that we have throughout the city, totaling over 81 square miles. So this could facilitate transferring density from the mountain areas to areas that would be appropriate for development. And you see, as shown on page 3 of your staff report, how that could occur. Offsite density transfers may also be, I'll restate what the policy says. It says that offsite density transfers may be allowed if it can be demonstrated that the additional density can be absorbed by the host site. So it does provide for a manner to do that. So that's what we're looking at here with this ordinance. As you'll recall with other projects that we've seen, for instance, open space parks recreation, where we have a golf course that essentially has no development right under the general plan. We looked at the policy LU 2.2 that discusses how open space density, or how open space can be converted, and it can be done either through an in-kind replacement of such open space elsewhere in the city, by making a payment of in lieu fees, or by replacing the converted open space through the use of density transfer. So the third option here, the use of density transfer, is what this ordinance that we have before you is trying to address. So the ordinance itself has, it establishes your sending and receiving sites. And I would probably just direct your attention to the examples that I've given you. What you have here on the screen is an example of a site that's 80 acres in the mountain. And so this would be your sending site for the transfer of development right transaction. This site is a fee-owned parcel, privately owned, and by definition of the general plan designation, open space mountain, they have a right to develop 2 units, or I should say 1 unit per 40 acres, but in this case it's 80 acres, so they would have the right to develop 2 units. So when you look at the ordinance and the 5 steps that define how you calculate the development right, step 1 is you identify the owner's reserved area. The reserved area in this case is 80 acres. Step 2, identify the undevelopable reserved area. In this case, there is no area that would have issue with meeting or have with easements or required landscape drainage or other environmental protections. While it's unlikely this site would ever be developed, there is still development potential based on the general plan. So under step 2, there are no acreages that would be undevelopable reserved areas. When we move to step 3 in the ordinance, when you have 80 acres, you would have a total of 80 acres of developable reserved area. And as I said, with the general plan designation of open space mountain, at a density of 1 dwelling unit per 40 acres, you'd get 2 units. So we would essentially, what the ordinance would allow for is you would transfer the development right from this site to another site within the city that would be appropriate for density. So the way the ordinance is currently written is that would happen through a conditional use permit process reviewed by the Planning Commission and the City Council. they would have to make the same findings that are typical for conditional use permits. So there's 5 findings associated with the CUP that's currently in the ordinance. So we reference that section of the ordinance. There are some additional stipulations in the current ordinance that allow for a transfer of bonus density. And that would be at the same rate that is currently allowed in the ESA SP zone, the Chino Cone area, Snow Creek areas. So that bonus would be 1.2 units at the receiving site for every 1 unit from the sending site. So it is consistent with that ordinance. And as I said, again, this would provide a way for not only staff to review and analyze projects that come in where there is no density, but also the public or developers who wanted to establish density where there is none currently. And it really puts the investigative work on the developer to go find the land that would be appropriate for preservation, and ultimately up to the city council to decide if that's appropriate. So that kind of summarizes the ordinance as it's written. Since this was prepared, we did have a couple of meetings, we had one meeting with our subcommittee today on this topic, and we have discussed some other alternatives that may be considered when calculating density and facilitating the transaction. So that may be something that the subcommittee members want to talk about further, but there may be some work that still needs to be done for the ordinance in order for the commission to make a good recommendation. So I'll conclude with that, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do any other members of the subcommittee want to talk? I could certainly summarize where we got to today, which was a concern about whether it would work given the densities that are allowed in the conservation areas, that the one per 40 acres wouldn't really allow, it isn't practical for a transfer. And what we discussed instead was possibly clearly identifying what the sending sites or the sites we're going to preserve in perpetuity, identifying those for high priority sites that the city and the public has been concerned with, including the Chino Cone, Angel Cove, Rim Rock, Oswald Canyon, those being some of the sites, and being more specific about where land could be transferred, and then being more specific about what the site that would gain development rights, and identify that with golf courses or privately owned designated open space in the main city, in the main areas of the city. So we looked at that, and we think it's worth taking some time to get to that, because the ordinance as drafted we don't think would have great applicability. Before we take questions, the other thing we looked at after some consultation with my consultation with the Conservancy group was that putting a conservation easement on a parcel is not the same as the parcel being owned by the city or a conservation group. So there's some provision for long-term maintenance. We've seen many sites that we want to preserve, but people use them as dumping grounds or shooting grounds, and that's not something we want to see happen. So that was the other thing that we had looked at and discussed in the subcommittee meeting. Commissioner Hirschbein.
So that first point you made about the practicable, being practical, are you saying that like with 1 unit per 40 acres, it would be too expensive to acquire enough acres to make a difference on a receiving site?
Yes.
Okay, so then are you saying that you would up the number of units that would be increased on the receiving site by, instead of the 1 unit per 40 acres, it would be some other calculation?
We didn't know, that was the problem, was we didn't have an easy way, and maybe our attorney can also step in. We didn't have an easy way of making that calculation without some kind of study that showed the nexus. So we thought the alternate way was being much more specific about the parcels that could be utilized and then taking a look at how we did them.
So for instance, this parcel might be worth X amount of additional
Right.
units.
Right, this
Okay.
parcel might be worth X amount, and there's some parcels that have fully recorded subdivisions on them that have never been built out, and they may have more value because they've been recorded, but the way this was written didn't identify that. Yet there are areas where people had wanted, there was a referendum to stop one of the subdivisions from being developed years ago. So the ordinance as written didn't take that into consideration, but we couldn't just arbitrarily say that 1 acre of mountain land was, that you'd have to, that 3 acres of mountain land would equal 1 acre of golf course that was being developed.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the commission. Sorry, we were having some technical difficulties with the mic down here. I think we had a good discussion this morning with the subcommittee, at least, opening up the topic and beginning to discuss those issues. TDRs are complicated. The most complicated part about these types of ordinances is developing that apples to apples equivalency of moving development rights from one site to another site and making sure that those reasonably match up so that it's legal and practical. And so we did discuss the draft ordinance that's been presented to the commission today, but then we also had a lot of these other conceptual discussions about where else we could go with it. Needless to say, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to look into these ideas and see what we can pencil out into an ordinance. That's basically it.
So at this point, if there are other questions of staff, otherwise we'll open the public hearing. Commissioner Hirschbein, yes.
So there's been a lot of discussion lately about the concept of this, and specifically as it relates to PDDs, but does that concept apply to density transfers as well? And if so, how do you justify that when the area that's going to be saved from development could be far away from the area that's potentially going to be developed?
Thank you, Commissioner Hirschbein. Nexus does indirectly come into play here. And again, that's where we get back to those equivalent values and trying to make sure we have an apples to apples comparison there. If a developer is going to get more development rights on the developer's property, and that's going to impact open space preservation on that lot, as long as you do the analysis right and you have that equivalency where off-site open space can be used to offset that, that still passes Nexus. It's just getting that equivalency right.
Would that not be the case if it was a PDD that we were subjecting that requirement to?
With a PDD, it's a little bit different. Part of the thing too is with our golf course ordinance, those transfers of development rights are also typically done in the context of...
Can I ask people not to use abbreviations because the members of the public may not know what the letters stand for?
Thank you, yes.
Planned Development District.
Typically, under our golf course ordinance, the way it's drafted is that transfers of development rights are done pursuant to a development agreement. And a development agreement is a negotiated contract that provides a bit more flexibility there. So that's how we deal with that. With a transfer of development rights, there's a more direct impact you can point to. This project will develop beyond what our code provides, but in doing so, it removes additional open space. But to offset that, there is off-site mitigation with open space. That's a little different than just the public benefit concept under the Planned Development District. And I can talk about that in more detail later.
Can you talk about the density transfer in terms of the difference between the general plan and the zoning of the particular parcel, be it the receiving or the open space one or the part that's being developed?
Well, I mean, the concept is that, and what we've tried to reduce into the ordinance here is that you've got a sending site and a receiving site. Both have a particular amount of density of development allowed under the general plan and the zoning code. And the interplay of the general plan and the zoning code is basically whichever one sets the most restrictive, density is the one that's going to govern. Once you've assessed, what the development potential is of each of those lots, then we would have a formula that would allow you to transfer that development potential from the sending site, or the one that we're trying to preserve as open space, over to the development site, which would be allowed to go higher than code would normally allow.
And I had one more question, thanks. And I'll make an observation first because it's like pre my question. It seems to me, I've been on Planning Commission for a little while and I was on AAC before that. We haven't had a lot of requests to increase density. It seems like it's been the opposite. Like we've taken R3 down to a kind of a small lot where it's even lower density than what the zoning is. Have we had a lot of requests in the past few years for a density increase in our zoning? Like spot zoning, like you would hear about in Los Angeles, for instance?
In the 4 years that I've been here in the city of Palm Springs, I can't think of an instance where we've had requests to increase the density. As you say, most of the requests that we've had have been to lower the actual density that's specified in the general plan.
We had only one, Flynn, and that was Serena Park. It was, for the public, it was a golf course conversion of an abandoned golf course which had been severely neglected and was creating a dust and other crisis for the surrounding neighbors. And in that instance, I think there were about 130, and I'm not sure, 130 some acres where they asked to take a golf course which was zoned as open space and have it be zoned as R1 and R2. I think there was some attached residential. And in exchange for that, they had a development agreement where they agreed with the city to provide $3 million for purchase of the last parcel of land in the Chino Cone where roads could be built in and something could be built in the Chino Cone. So that's the only one that I recall. It involved a golf course. Am I correct on that?
You're correct, but it didn't. Commissioner Hirschbein's question was relative to exceeding density.
No.
And at Serena Park, they were consistent with the general plan amendment for the residential density that was being proposed.
Right, the previous density.
Correct. They had no density before, but with the general plan amendment, they're consistent with the residential designations that now exist there.
Right, and the neighboring residential designations.
Thank you.
So the density transfer probably in this instance would really apply to the portion of golf courses that were converted to some other use. And that's one of the reasons why in the subcommittee we thought possibly something could be much more specific. Are there any other questions, Commissioner Woods?
I'm not sure if my mic is on or not. Can you hear me?
Can you
okay?
put your mic on?
It
Hit
says
it about
on,
3
but it's not
times.
lit. It says, can you hear me? If you, this may not be a fair question. Do you know if we have done a transfer of development rights in the city? And if we have, has that been done through a development agreement or through some other mechanism?
I've been there 13 years. I don't think we've done one in that time.
I've never done it, okay.
Yeah. And we've had development agreements. Those are really have been the mechanism to facilitate large developments that usually require some density.
Great, okay, thanks. In the example that we just got with the 80 acres that has, you were allowed 2 units on that 80 acres. If those 2 units were built, you know, we have to really ask the question, what is conservation and is it still conserved? But I think the really question is coming up is we're trying to use this for golf courses. And I guess my question is, golf courses currently, are they listed as open space in our general plan?
They're correct. They're open space parks recreation designation.
So they would be prime for something like a development agreement, and okay. But the open space for golf courses in our general plan, does it allow any units whatsoever?
No.
So that seems like that might be a little problematic in a transfer of development rights.
Well, it essentially would create a way to establish development in areas that don't have a right to develop it. It was probably, in other words, it would allow for land that's probably not ripe for development and preserve that land and transfer it to a land that could be ripe for development, like the flatter areas of the city.
Thanks, David. I'm just a little confused. So if it's open space in our general plan with no designation for any units whatsoever, there's nothing to transfer. The city attorney can.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Any sort of golf course conversion is necessarily going to involve a number of entitlements. The first one, just to get it through the door, would be a general plan amendment, because otherwise that open space designation would prohibit any sort of reuse of that property besides, you know, open space recreational purposes. Once you're going down that path, there may be a possibility for transfer of development rights. You know, it's speculative right now, you know, who can see into the future. But certainly, you're right, that as it currently stands, a golf course would not have any residential units to transfer or accept even, because they could not develop it with that general plan land use designation. So that hurdle would have to be cleared, as well as other entitlements before you're even talking transfer of development.
Thanks, that clarifies it. And that's irregardless of the zoning, because the general plan would override, the zoning just implements the general plan.
The general plan is, it preempts the zoning. So yeah, the general plan is the constitution for the city's land use. Everything has to comply with the general plan.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
At this point, there being no further questions, the public hearing is opened. And if you would come forward.
Hi, my name is Tanya Petrovna, and I'd just like to say, as I've listened to your conversation, that knowing when you do transfers in the mountains, not all species, animal and plant life, thrive there. There's different zones, as when we speak about the environment, that certainly some things fare well on the valley floors and do not thrive or live at all in the mountain areas. Just to make a note of that, if you go forward to think of these transfers and your apples and oranges, thank you.
Hi, I'm Michelle Johnson from Palm Springs. I just don't think it's right that you take open space from one area and give those rights to someplace else. It could be out in the boonies someplace, or if it goes to the mountain, well, that's not accessible to most people who it's accessible to now. And the traffic and the noise and everything else it adds to the existing neighborhoods is just, you know, astronomical compared to what's there now. And if the streets go through that weren't there now, it's going to make traffic horrible. And there's just so many things not fair about giving those rights to someplace else instead of where they are.
Are there any other members of the public who wish to speak?
Hi, my name is Dan Barber. I'm the current president of the Los Compadres neighborhood organization. I've been dealing with some of this stuff. You guys have been dealing it a lot longer, but since last February, one of my first comments is I'm appalled at the lack of a communication, the lack of information, and the confusion that has gone on since then. Today was a perfect example. Commissioner Woods was still kind of confused and everything. Every time I have gone to the Planning Commission, this has been on the average of about once every 2 weeks, I get a different answer. I have met with several of you sitting here today, and one of the things I've been appalled at is the general plan has one area, then we have a zoning area. Some of these golf courses are on Indian land. How many? We have, the last I heard, there were, I think, 11 potential golf courses. 2 of those are on Indian land. One time there was going to be a moratorium. Now we don't know there is. Get the facts together. Let us know in the public when you're going to meet so we can talk about this. Get our people together. We are the people. I'm one of the people of the organized neighborhoods, and I get the phone calls. What's happening? I get angry residents. What's happening? If you guys don't know the answer, as Commissioner Woods didn't know today or confused, can you imagine what the residents feel? I've lived in this city since 1991. One of the most enjoyable things to me is I go down Farrell Drive every day to get to my house. I see a lot of open space and that beautiful mountain view. How much is that going to be taken away? How much of this transfer? I used to work in the energy business, so I did a lot of those transfers of energy rights. So the 35 acres in Bel Air Greens, how much of that is going to be left to open space, and how much of it is going to be transferred? Or is it going to be, I've seen 5 different examples of what they wanted to do with this space. It's not clear to residents, it's not fair to residents. I think you guys, and you're doing a great job, don't get me wrong, but yes, you need more time. I was one of the big people that were pushing for the moratorium so this information could get together in all of the neighborhoods, because it's going to affect us all. It's going to affect Palm Springs for generations to come with the amount of open space. I just want it to be fair. I want them all to be equal. I don't want to have Bel Air Greens, Indian Canyons, because they're on Indian land, treated one way, and then you've got Tockwitz Creek and somebody else, or Mesquite something else. Get your act together. Get it, take your time, and do it right, because you are going to affect this city for a good 100 years. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman. My name is Rush Youthy. I've been a resident of this town for about 15 years. I represent Sonora Sunrise, which consists of about 1,800 homes. Can you imagine how many phone calls I'm getting? I'm going crazy. I didn't even know I wanted to speak today because I was so confused about where we are and where we're going. I had a long conversation with Albert Cole, who alleges to be a part owner of Bel Air. I asked him if he was a tribal member. He said no. But the records also indicate that Tommy Jacobs is part owner. Is he a member of the tribe? I don't know. Is Bel Air Indian land, a latte? And who's the lessees? Who are the owners? I don't know. And I think somebody better spend some time checking in on the legal capacity of who we're talking with on Bel Air Greens. He told me that they settled a contract that's going to be converted to fee simple, but there's a caveat. Caveat is that the city lets us do what we want to do first. Now, I don't understand this. You know, when you look at the moratorium possibility, one thinks, well, maybe it's not useful anymore. Well, it is. Because our plan, our general plan, our code is messed up, it's very old. Now, I understand that they're going to be talking about sending it to outside agency to help speed up the process, but we don't know what that is. And, you know, we have 85% of this land is open spaces. What is that going to do if you cut down on the Indian country clubs? That's going to shrink it down. It looks to me that we're on a path to become another little Orange County. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak? If you'd come forward.
I'm Darrell Thomas, and I'm recently moved to Palm Springs from Texas. And in Texas, we have similar situations as far as open spaces. But to me, what I see is the Indian land, they're not involved in these meetings. I mean, I haven't seen one tribal leader here. And so we're just floundering around if we're not getting their buy-in onto the whole situation too, or wondering what it is that they want to do with that land. I mean, we could just throw rocks at each other all the time. So why are they not here to participate in what to do? The other thing in regards to the moratorium, I thought that the moratorium was already going to happen, but apparently that's not the situation, because I think that this is a long thing to look at. But if we're looking at, you know, doing the transfer of developmental rights, Bel Air is worth more than 80 acres in the mountains. I mean, the mountains are huge, but once that land here in the middle of Palm Springs is developed, it's gone. And we like that open space. It does good things for floodplain control. It gives people the ability to walk around freely. It doesn't need to be created into a park. It could be natural land. And I think that we definitely need that inside the city, or we will be like another version of Orange County. Thank you.
Ruth Cienfuegos, Palm Springs. I was born here, and I see us moving in a direction of less and less space, taller buildings, which is basically reducing and eliminating our natural resource, which is the beauty of Palm Springs. We are such a small, confined area that we are never going to grow and expand outward, but if we keep going inward and taking away our open spaces, we lose the actual resource that is Palm Springs, and the only reason we exist here and that people want to come here. And also it's damaging to our population because, as I explained, we need the open space. If we're going to do a trade-out, it needs to be a minimal, if anything, and really shouldn't be a trade-out because that was not the intention either of the open space created in the 2007 plan. So I'm for the moratorium. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak? The public hearing is closed. I just wanted to take a moment to answer some of your questions, even though it's on a slightly different topic. We don't know at this point the status of Bel Air Greens. They've had a couple of proposals into us, none of which have turned into applications. I have been told, the same as you, that the moratorium has not yet happened, and it will be rescheduled. The discussion at City Council will be rescheduled. I do believe that our legal counsel is looking into the status of the leases, which are stand in our agreement with the tribe, are exceptions to the ability of the Planning Commission and City Council to make decisions on allotee land. So those are issues that the city is looking at, and I believe those are what is holding up the discussion of the moratorium at City Council. That is not in our purview. The Planning Commission at an earlier meeting unanimously did indicate that we would like the council to take that up, but it's not something the Planning Commission has the authority or ability to do. What we are moving forward with is the discussions that we have started on, and there are 4 of them today, on there is a provision in our general plan regarding the transfer of development rights So we were trying to figure out some ways if it was reasonable to codify it, and I think that's what's in front of us, because we have language but no, actually no direction in the general plan. So that being said, I don't know if that answers your questions, but at least I can tell you that we've been continuing to work on this, and we've been looking at the golf course ordinance not because we want to give away our open space, but we want to have some way to preserve it because it's privately owned, and we don't want our golf courses to get into the situation that the old Palm Springs golf course got into, where it was fallow and blowing sand, and a hazard to the people living around it. So we understand that this is a balance, but we're trying to work through a balance with you and with the council. And I think that said, I hope that's okay to Flynn to make that statement, but I think what I'd like to do is for people to talk to the ordinance, the draft that's in front of us. And one of the things we discussed today was whether this would be helpful at all. I think the Transfer of Development Rights Ordinance, and we wanted to pursue it a little bit further before we decide that we have no way of figuring out how we do it short of an appraisal or a development agreement, but we did want to look at it. The goal, again, for the general public is not to give away lands for nothing, but if a private developer they can meet the conditions that somebody doesn't buy a golf course from someone at a high price, not expecting that they will have to enter into an agreement to buy some other lands that replace the open space that's utilized. Because if you go and buy a golf course for $10 million and then you find out that we want to keep people from paying a lot. It's just basically trying to make the economics clear to people who are looking at that land for potential development, that they need to go through a series of steps and a series of payments. I think that's, yep. If anybody wants to talk to the issue at hand, please do.
Yes, I think there was a lot of discussion about what is the appropriate ratio of lands in the mountains, for example, or if we were to allow for a golf course to convert, and we have it's a completely discretionary action and sometime in the future if we were to do that. I think I did some back of the envelope calculations here and under staff's proposal, which is we're not proposing to approve that today or anything, but would be roughly 2,500 acres of the mountain areas to have to be preserved for the roughly 100 units that is proposed for Bel Air. So that's the type of ratio that's being talked about. It's, we all the arguments for it against it, whether we think it's a good idea or a bad idea, but it's certainly not one for one. And, I think the ordinance, if we look at the golf course ordinance itself, conversion, it sets a series of very high bars that before any conversion could be even considered, and potentially I think it starts off with a 50% savings of the existing open space on the golf course area. And then for the loss of the other 50%, we might consider off-site preservation in the mountains or whatever. The city does have a whole lot of goals on trying to preserve the mountains as well, so that this is one area that it is just being considered. And the reason why, and one of the reasons it's a little confusing is because it is very confusing. There's a lot of unknowns. We can't quite figure out, we don't know the exact status of the Bel Air lands in terms of, right now we're trying to figure out who has what legal rights. Correspondingly for Mesquite Golf Course, the associations that are out there, we're trying to figure out what those rights are and how they would be exercised. So it's a very complicated process and procedure. So I'm going to be certainly recommending a continuance on this item when we get to it because it does need some more research. And I would certainly express some concern about using units, and I think I expressed this in the committee, that I don't think that's the appropriate unit for doing the conversions. I'd like to see some different ones that we discussed at the committee and go forward at that and have this come back at some time when we've got a better set of ways to figure out the conversion.
So I'd like to make a motion that we continue this based on everything that we've discussed and the attorney has told us.
I'll second it. Do you want to continue to a time certain or to a time certain or time, probably just a general?
What I would recommend is that we not continue it to a date certain, but rather give staff time to do additional research, and then we'll renotice this as a public hearing when it comes back.
I think this is the first time that this particular ordinance has gotten into a real form, and when we look at it, we got some more work to do. So.
Madam Chair, if I could.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank people who are here participating in the public process. I think it's always a sustainable city when we have people participate, and it's appreciated. I don't know if I personally appreciate being attacked, but I can tell you that I have 30 years worth of experience, and my questions were not out of ignorance and not out of confusion at all. We received on our dais here 9 letters or comments from different people. There is confusion out there. My line of questioning was to help people either in the audience or at home get clarification on some of the issues they had brought up in their comments, because they may not be here to speak, they may not want to speak, they may not feel comfortable in speaking, and I think it's imperative that we bring it up. I am total support of continuing this. I think it is a very hefty issue to look at, but I do want to reiterate, at 30 years of experience, and I've done many density transfers, there is no ignorance behind Commissioner Woods.
Yeah, I think we should continue this also, and that we should also look at some of solicit some of the comments that we got in just a informal way from the Coachella Valley Mountains Conservancy, which took a look at it in terms of if there was a density transfer, what mechanisms would guarantee both the fairness of the transfer and also the upkeep of the area that was being preserved. So I think that's one additional thing that we need to look at, both the mechanism and if mountain land is being preserved, how it's being preserved. So we have a motion, we have a second. Would you call the question? And that continuance passes unanimously. Moving to the second public hearing item, which is the City of Palm Springs for a zone text amendment to establish a citywide ordinance for the redevelopment of golf courses. Staff report, please.
Chair Wermuck and Planning Commissioners, at your September 12th meeting of this year, you continued the subject text amendment without holding a hearing or discussion, and allowed staff to work on the transfer of development rights ordinance as we discussed today. Staff incorporated changes that reference the transfer of development rights ordinance, and those obviously, if we are not acting on that ordinance or taking that ordinance forward, would have to be stricken from the ordinance. So I'll just go through those real quick with you. On the strikeout version, the marked up version, the red underline and strike through version of the ordinance, which is the red text, is probably the easiest to reference and go through it. Page 2 of the document, you'll see reference B1, little b 3, you have the reference to a conditional use permit as a requirement if a density transfer is proposed. So we would recommend, if you do take action today, that number 3 be eliminated, and we would take number 3 out in its entirety. Moving on to page 6 of the marked up version, at the bottom, paragraph D1B, other actions. So we would also remove some of the text that's in red as it relates to a conditional use permit requirement for the transfer of development right. Otherwise, the changes that you see in the document are consistent with the recommendations that were provided by the Planning Commission back in June, as well as some changes that the subcommittee had recommended as a part of the overall improvement of the draft ordinance. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and this is a public hearing. Thank you.
Questions for staff?
Madam Chair, before you
Yes.
hear any questions, I just wanted to point out, even though we are suggesting these strikeouts to the draft ordinance here, it does not eliminate the transfer of development rights concept entirely from golf course conversions. It would just put it through the development agreement process.
Well, it's still in the general plan, isn't it?
It's still in the general plan, yes.
So it's still pertinent, but not
It's
but
just
not codified.
Yeah, it's just the way of getting there is different under the golf course
Right.
ordinance. It would be through development agreement.
I have a question of staff, but does anybody else first? Commissioner Hirschbein?
Maybe for my benefit and the public as well, could you summarize the development standards under this ordinance?
Certainly. So at the very last section, section F, is where the development standards are part of the ordinance. The minimum open space requirements for a conversion is 50%. 50% of the land is to remain open, and it includes greenways, landscape buffers, water channels, waterways, and to the extent feasible, artificial ponds, and is based on the gross acreage of a project. There's a whole section dedicated to what defines a desert greenway, with minimum sizes as well as stipulations related to existing trees, the preservation of existing trees. There are building setback requirements for single-story structures on a proposed golf course development. 50-foot setback is required from the property lines adjacent to surrounding areas. That would be an average. That's a minimum, 50 foot, and then the average being no less than 35. There's a multi-story structure setback requirement of 150 feet from existing development adjacent to the golf course property to the new structures on the property. And that would be a minimum of 150 foot setback, but a reduction could occur to 100 feet if buffered by a desert greenway. And those are really the major, kind of the bigger ticket items in terms of the development standards. There are some other standards as it relates to floodplains and stormwater management requirements. One thing I would also note that any proposed golf course conversion, the application process is a two-part process for the public, for the benefit of the public. The first part is an intent to convert application, where there are a whole series of items that an applicant would have to go through in terms of alternatives to a proposed development, including preservation as a golf course, partial conversion of a golf course, as well as the proposed full development of the course with still meeting the requirements of this ordinance in terms of the 50% open space. So that would be the first part. There are requirements to have public meetings in the intent to convert application. After that is completed to the satisfaction of staff, then they could submit the full and formal entitlement applications, which would include the general plan amendment as necessary, as well as a development agreement in order to establish the terms of any proposed application, entitlement application, and any other entitlements that would be necessary for a formal development proposal. So there are quite a bit of requirements that would go into any proposed golf course development should it occur based on these ordinance requirements. So I'll conclude with that. Happy to answer your other questions.
A follow-up question on open space. The definitions, what I'm interested in, not that it be driveway or not driveway, but assuming there's a significant amount of open space on a particular project, is there any requirement in this ordinance on maintenance and access, public access?
There's no requirement that the 50% open space be publicly accessible. It has to be maintained as open space, though.
Well, I'm talking about maintenance, I don't know, tree trimming, unblocking washes, that kind of thing.
Well, it would have to be maintained in accordance with standard property maintenance requirements that we have in the ordinance now, but whose responsibility of that is not defined in the ordinance.
And that really depends on the project, frankly. I mean, if it's in the public right-of-way, the city may be responsible for maintaining it, but it's on HOA property, or if it's just personally, privately owned property. But there will be general maintenance standards on that property.
And this would also be subject to possibly a development agreement as well, is that correct?
Correct. Any application that would come forward is required to submit a specific plan, a general plan amendment, and a development agreement.
Thank you.
And the public access would be negotiated if allowed through the development agreement process.
Public access to property for park purposes or whatever would again be governed by Nexus, our watchword for the day.
Mm-hmm.
However, with a development agreement, because that's a negotiated contract between developer and city, the city could obtain more property rights if they can negotiate that into a development agreement beyond Nexus. But that would be through a development agreement.
But just in terms of your questions, any open space that was required for a approved use would not count as open space for the 50% requirement. Therefore, in one of the iterations of Bel Air Greens, we saw a hotel development that had an open space requirement. That wouldn't count toward the 50% open space in this ordinance. Am I correct?
Correct.
Are there other questions? I had two that Commissioner Woods.
I'd like to direct this to the attorney, if I could, just to Jim. And I want to follow up on my earlier questioning, where we heard that a golf course, if it's open space in the general plan, cannot have development taken away from it. Obviously, there's nothing to transfer or be a receiver site for a transfer. However, and this question is for the edification of everyone listening as well, a development agreement can override all of that.
What a development agreement, I don't mean to get too much in the weeds here, but when you're talking about a large project, such as a golf course, a shopping center, some very large project, when you do a development agreement, it's not just done in isolation. It will have all of the land use entitlements wrapped up with it. General plan amendment, zone changes, CUPs, any sort of other entitlements there. And then typically what the development agreement does is it then takes those entitlements, it locks them in, and then the benefit to the developer is the developer gets to use those entitlements for a far longer period of time than under normal circumstances. Typically, it would be 2 years and you got to get kicking on your development. The development agreement may allow them to go 5, 10, sometimes I've done them as long as 20 years, where the vesting lasts that long, buys the developer a lot of time to ultimately develop the project. But those are still tied to other entitlements, and oftentimes it goes to the city council as a big package. you know, a number of entitlements along with the development agreement, so.
Which could include something like a general plan amendment to go from open space to something else.
It would have to in the context of a golf course conversion, yes.
But for the general public, what we're proposing is something that is still discretionary. Because it involves a general plan amendment, it is discretionary. It isn't a foregone conclusion that somebody would come in with a golf course conversion proposal and it would be approved. It's still a discretionary
Yes, a general plan
vote
amendment.
by both the Planning Commission, so there's a lot of room for public input.
Right, so it is a discretionary land use decision, yes.
Yes.
I wanted to walk through a couple of things with staff and kind of confirm that the way this would work. But we got started on this from our perspective with the Serena Park, Palm Springs Golf Course issue, where the property owner just decided, well, we're not going to operate the golf course anymore. And it became a horrendous mess, and it still is for all the people that live down there, and is basically blighted, and we did not want to get into that situation again. We cannot say legally that we cannot redevelop any golf course. The Supreme Court and the Constitution basically say you can't, that becomes a taking, what's called a taking, and you have to pay, the government agency would have to pay for the property under that mode. So we want to make it difficult to, or challenging to convert a golf course, but we still have to allow it in some cases. But we've set up here, and Dave, can you correct me if I say any of this wrong? There's a series of tests before you could even get to the point of converting the golf course. One of the tests include assessing the adjacent homeowners association's ability to, what rights do they have over the golf course? And I think in the case of Mesquite Golf Course, if you correct me if I'm wrong, there are some existing rights that would probably preclude any conversion right from the start. So when we're worried about Farrell, that's probably going to be maybe a difficult one to convert just because of other issues. They have to demonstrate that they cannot feasibly financially operate the golf course anymore. They have to consider an option that would be partial conversion, like maybe doing a shorter course rather than the full 18-hole course that may be out there. They have to demonstrate that all of these are infeasible before they even get to the point of considering a full conversion. They have to consider donation or potential purchase of the property by some government or homeowners association or nonprofit group that could operate the land as a golf course or a public park. They have to demonstrate that all of those are infeasible before they get to the point of potentially converting. So it's a long and challenging road, long par 5 or par 16 probably, actually, before you could even get to that point. And then you'd have to go into the conversion process, which says that you'll have to preserve, under this ordinance at least, 50% of the open space on site in any case, and then potentially, if allowed, 50% off-site. That's the basic thrust of the core of what we have here. And I understand a lot of people, I'm definitely listening to people in terms of what they like. We have to have some way that meets both the Supreme Court tests, but makes it a challenge to convert a golf course. I think that's where we are. Dave, if I said that correctly?
Yes.
There was one other point that I forgot to bring up that I don't know if is in here, and I know we went.
So these are still questions of staff, and that was your question of staff?
Yes. That's why I did that.
Uh-huh. Very clever. Okay.
Well, I wanted to get the discussion out here because there's a lot of incorrect information.
Okay, that's your question of staff. Correct. I have two for staff. One is the definition of a golf course in this broad enough to encompass a golf course that has gone feral and that is no longer operating? Because I didn't find that language here, and I think it has to be someplace in this ordinance.
It's not currently in the ordinance.
Okay, so that's something that we can look at. And then water courses can be in this ordinance, water courses can be part of the open space. Is there any limitation that would exclude a water course that has been channelized into a concrete channel?
That would be in the standards, and there's nothing in here that would prohibit that from being part of the open space, nor is there anything that defines whether that's good or bad, or, I mean, it's not really discussed in the ordinance.
Thank you. That's just, those were two items that I noticed that we possibly hadn't covered in previous questions. For the public, and I don't know, have people in the audience pulled the staff, hopefully you've pulled the staff report and the ordinance itself from so you've looked at it and you've looked at the changes when you comment. I think at this point I want to open public comment since the city is technically the applicant. There won't be a applicant on this, but you have 3 minutes.
My name is Michael Johnson. I live in Demuth Park, near some of the golf courses in question.
If you speak into the mic, it's a little short for you, so.
I don't certainly mean to suggest any ignorance on the part of any individual, but I do think there's a great deal of confusion, and I'd like to commend the Planning Commission and the subcommittees. I've had the pleasure of watching some of these meetings, and there's no doubt the level of hard work that you've put into this, but I think there remains a lot of confusion at the general city level. I want to reference the general plan, because the comment was made that the general plan essentially is the law, and yet with respect to open space, the priorities listed in the general plan, the city has not met them since 2007. In the general plan, 11 golf courses were listed, some of which no longer exist. Those comprise 90% of the acreage depicted in the general plan as being open space. We've already lost some of that. And we know that others of those are on Indian leased land, which creates, as those following Bel Air know, a great deal of issues. There's a statement in the general plan that the goal is 5 acres per 1,000 residents. And it shows a forecasted growth of the city that we would be certainly not meeting it today. It also talks about park space being within a mile of people's residences. So I appreciate that some open space is in park, but I think the concept of moving open space up into the mountains defeats that purpose of having access to park space. But I guess I need to make the plea that there be some recognition that there's a great deal of confusion with respect to the zoning and the general plan. When the signage that was put up on Bel Air Greens by the city and the Planning Commission noting that there had been proposals, the zoning was clearly marked as R1C. Yet, in the discussions, it was declared open space after the fact of the original purchase. And of course, that led to confusion and led to some discrepancies with Ash Incorporated, the current alleged owners. I want to reference the letter that was in the packet from SBEMP, the attorneys representing Ash, on August 31 of this year, and some of the points that they made in that, because I think they're significant. I think those are issues that need to be addressed to make this ordinance more bulletproof, if you will. One of them was the suggestion that they imagined that the improvement and maintenance cost of any open space that is preserved if a golf course is converted, that the cost of those fall to the seller or the developer. But that's not clearly spelled out, as has already been indicated. If it's not spelled out, it's not clear. It's not going to be done. There was no provision in the general plan for access to budget to increase open space, which is probably the reason we don't have as much as we even had then. Without dedicated funds or a plan to get those funds, it's unrealistic to think we're going to have any more open space. The analysis in the general plan didn't address which of those golf courses were leased land.
I'm going to give you 30 seconds more if you can wrap up.
So I would suggest that we need a situational analysis of where we are today with respect to open space, because it's clear that the general plan is not a suggestion of where we currently are. And I guess my final comment would be perhaps someone could clarify what Nexus is. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is David Friedman. For the record, I'm a resident of the Indian Canyons neighborhood. North course of the Indian Canyons Golf Resort. However, I'm not speaking on behalf of the neighborhood organization. And while I do have a comment related to my work on the Sustainability Commission, I'm also not speaking on behalf of the Sustainability Commission. With that on the record, just a couple of comments. First of all, I would like to echo the comments made by other speakers. It is not clear to whether the ordinance would apply to Alati land. I read the land use contract that Council approved 2 weeks ago is that it would, but that really should be specified. I realize that that is not an issue for the Commission, as Chair Warmiak has mentioned, but when this goes through the Commission and up to Council, that should be clarified in discussions with the Tribal Council. Once again, it's my understanding that it would apply, but that's a big issue for us and for other golf courses on Alati land. Second, I'd like to echo the comment that my good friend Mr. Naus made in the letter he submitted that's the very last page of your package, and that's the potential role of neighborhood organizations if there's to be no conversion. And the language that is in section C2A of the draft under the developer's alternative assessment under no conversion, it refers to existing property owners associations or new associations with existing neighborhood or which owns or manages residential unit or common area within 500 feet. Well, the neighborhood organizations under the city's ordinance, we don't actually manage any property, but if that language could potentially be broadened, there could be a role for the neighborhood organizations that may require a change in the city's ordinance. But to give you an example, as you may have heard, our neighborhood organization has just completed a very successful membership drive or social plan drive with the tribe, and so the tribe will be getting more than $100,000 from our residents of our neighborhood to keep the clubhouse open and have more people out on the North Club Golf Course. So there is definitely a role for the neighborhood organization. We're not officially doing it, it's for the tribe. We sponsored it and we're successful in getting a large money collected, and will be turned over to the tribe in the next couple of days, and they'll start opening the clubhouse starting on November 1st. And finally, wearing my Sustainability Commission hat, as you know, I worked on the Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, which is codified as Section 860 of the Municipal Code. The development standards, I believe F4 refers to following CVWD, but doesn't have a reference
I'm
to
going to
the...
give you 30 seconds more, but
yeah.
please.
Yes. Got it, almost done. Does not have a reference to the Water Efficient Landscaping Ordinance, and my suggestion is that there would be a cross-reference in the development standards that that section of the municipal code needs to be complied with.
Did you submit written comments with the two changes you suggested?
No, with all due respect, Chair Wormiuk, I've been busy on other matters for the city in 1PS, and so this was my project between 11:30 and 12:30 last night, but be happy to work on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak?
Again, Dan Barber from Los Compadres neighborhood. First of all, I'd like to apologize. My intent was not to attack any one commissioner. I did just notice that at the time that I spoke, Commissioner Woods, you were the only one who was courageous enough.
He'll live.
So saying that you were confused, others did later. So I wanted to say that, but my other real question was, we've been talking about the transfers. And one of them that's very unclear to me, and if someone can answer it, it'll be a done deal. I heard that the 50% is supposed to stay open space. At one point at one of the subcommittee hearings, there was like a limit talked about of how much of that other 50% could be transferred. I mean, I remember hearing at one point, and I'll just use Bel Air Greens, it was 35 acres, 50% was supposed to stay open space, that's 17 and a half. And that other half of the other 17 and a half would be up for grabs.
Could be.
Is there an upper limit, or is it, of that leftover 50% that can be transferred?
We'll try and get to answers when we talk, but at this point,
Okay.
we don't answer questions when people are in front of us.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, Honorable Commissioners, staff, council, my name is Wayne Grelnick. I'm with the law firm of Grelnick, Gillen, and Knighton in Palm Desert, California. I'm here representing Mesquite Country Club Homeowners Association. I also represent about 60 HOAs in this community, 300 in the desert, and about 20 golf courses. I want to first thank the subcommittee, tireless work, countless hours, did a fantastic job. The ordinance we're talking about today creates a roadmap where none exists now. It provides protections to the homeowners and the HOAs in relationship to a potential golf course conversion where none exists now. It provides solutions where none exist now. I encourage you to approve this and send it to the City Council. I do suggest that Madam Chair's comments are well taken in relationship to the one golf course that is fallow now and is not operating. Suggest a definition that would include a definition for golf course to include anything that's fallow and its last use was a golf course and something of that nature. And thank you very much.
Hi again, Michelle Johnson, Demuth Park. Once again, towards the transfer to mountain area. The mountains have a humongous amount of open space. The city's got almost none. Plus, you're trading land that's not, you're going to land that's basically probably not buildable because of the topography and everything to land that, can be. And from what I remember in the previous discussions, what they're proposing for open space is little pieces here and there. Trading 35 acres for piecemeal pockets here and there isn't really equal to open space. And maybe it's not for this, but somebody did mention that okaying for a two-story. I hope it doesn't go through at all, but there was mention of two-story being allowed. None of the neighborhoods around there are two-story. That's not going to blend in with the neighborhoods. That's something else that needs to be thought about, is how it affects the next door neighborhoods and stuff, and how it's gonna fit in with them. And thanks for all your work. You have done a great job.
Are there any other members of the public?
Hello, Tanya Petrovna again. I would just like to echo the sentiment that Michael spoke about earlier. If the general plan as is, of the 2007 version, allocates a certain amount of acreage per person for open space, and if that is not being met now, how are we meeting that by reducing open space? For example, golf courses being reduced to 50%. So it's a little bit of a confusion I have, and I just wanted to state that I'm probably not alone. Thank you.
Are there other members of the public who'd like to speak? There being no other members of the public hearing is closed, and this matter is before the commission. Can I sort of start down that end? Commissioner Woods, do you have comments first?
Certainly. One of the comments we heard from the audience, I agree with, and we may want to ask, and that was particularly on item, it's on page 4 of 11, developer alternative statements, item 2A II. The concern was neighborhood organizations don't manage. We could say manage, and or represent. We could add the word represent to that. Also on page 5 of 11, as we go through the discussion with this, item number 3A, which is neighborhood outreach meetings for those of you in the audience. We have buffed this up quite a bit.
Which page is that?
It's page 5 of 11, under neighborhood outreach meetings. One of the things that we added was that there would be a website established so that there'd be broader acknowledgement or knowledge of a transfer. I think we had also asked that one of the meetings be more general in nature and almost the community in general, not just the neighbors, because I think when we spoke before, changing or converting a golf course is more significant than just the neighbors. It's a huge, which we heard in testimony today, it's a much larger issue. So I think just adding some verbiage, and would let staff do that a meeting be more broad in nature. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Do you have a section you wanted to add that to?
Give me a minute to work on it, and I'll be happy to.
Commissioner Maruzzi?
Can the city attorney clarify, to the best of your ability, where we stand as relates to the Alatea issue on Bel Air Gardens? Alatea tribal land?
Thank you, Commissioner. Madam Chair, members of the Commission. Bel Air Greens, as our office understands it, is Alatea land, which is that in-between category of tribal land. There's certain tribal land that's what we call trustee land. City does not have land use jurisdiction over it. On the other hand, there's also what's called fee-owned land, which the city does have jurisdiction on. Alatea land is in that in-between category. Now, the council did approve an updated agreement with the Agua Caliente tribe 2 weeks ago, as I recall, that set out that relationship. And as a general rule under that agreement, the city does have land use jurisdiction over Alatea land, which would mean the golf course ordinance, a moratorium ordinance would apply. However, there is a particular section in the lease, section 11, as I recall, that says that the city will not have jurisdiction over Alatea land to the extent it interferes with any federally negotiated lease. We're trying to find out what those leases are, what the nature is of those leases, and we've been reaching out to the tribe to get those. Once we understand the nature of those leases, we'll have a better understanding about the land use jurisdiction over those golf courses.
So would this Alatea issue, though, affect this ordinance and our ability to move forward with it?
The Alatea issue in and of itself does not. It depends on what these leases say. If these leases were federally negotiated leases by BIA or Department of Interior, then our land use jurisdiction may be limited. But again, we're trying to find that right now.
But nonetheless, we could recommend this ordinance move to the city council without resolving these issues for Alatea land and Bel Air Gardens.
The Planning Commission could recommend that, certainly.
For Bel Air Greens, there's been public comment about the various ideas for that land, but there is no formal application, correct, that has been applied? Isn't it all been a study session?
No, we have a general plan amendment that has been submitted for the site.
Okay. In terms of what this subcommittee did over many, many months, we had open discussion with the public. The public was invited, the public spoke. We got a lot of great input. The attorney representing the numerous HOAs and golf courses has been a big part of this discussion. And I'd like to point out that his recommendation that we move forward with this is based on his knowledge as an attorney of what is best for HOAs and for the city as relates to golf courses, because we have absolutely no roadmap as it is currently. And I have to say that it isn't just our opinion as members of the Planning Commission, but the public has been a big part of this discussion and how this ordinance was prepared. So that's why it's coming forward today. After all the many months that we have gone over this, this is the best ordinance that we thought we could come up with at this point.
Michael?
So we're on comments now. Right?
We're just on comments, yes.
Okay. So that's not me. I have two comments right now. First of all, thank you subcommittee members for this, because this is huge. It's a huge effort. It's a very sensitive issue, obviously, for the community. I think that, yeah, so those are just two comments. But I want to make comments specifically about the ordinance. One is on the waterways, and I know the chairperson brought it up as far as channelized concrete ditches or what's called riprap, which is large boulders. I think there should be language under the waterways requirement as open space that it be termed naturalized. There should be something in there about naturalized waterways, that concrete channels, in my estimation, do not constitute open space. And then the other comment I have specifically about the ordinance has to do with public access to the open space. Right now, you guys, the community's living in this sort of fantasy that this golf course that's been not in use for many years is sort of a public park, but it's not. It's private land, and technically they could put a fence up around it and keep everybody out. But to make the leap to that something that's going to be developed has to include access for the public, I'm in favor of, actually. I think we should. I think the ordinance should specify that certain types of the open space that will be provided under this be allowed to be accessed by the public. Otherwise, I think we lose the benefit of the open space. And okay, that's all I got for now.
For the general public, we did include one of the goals, which was views, the preservation of views, and not just the preservation of open space. So there are many reasons to do this. But I was going in order. If it's okay if I make comments, and I'll go to you next. I think it would be good for staff possibly to comment on the park allocations that are in the general plan, which I think the level that we anticipate in terms of parks will be met. I don't believe golf courses are included in the park open space categories of the general plan. Am I correct in that, Flynn, of the current plan?
Yes.
Mr. Newell, if you would comment.
Sure. So in the city's recreation, open space, and conservation element, there's discussion about public parks and golf course open spaces. And the goal of that document is to have, it says, minimum of 5 acres of community parks and 2.5 acres, or excuse me, a minimum of 5 acres of developed parks be available for every 1,000 residents, including 2.5 acres for community parks, for neighborhood parks. So the goal is essentially for every 1,000 residents, we have 5 acres of park space. Currently, what it says is we have 156 acres that is developed park space, not including golf courses. So at the ultimate build out of the city, there is additional parkland that would be needed. However, that's not factored in at this time because we're not at build out. We're well under build out.
But this golf courses weren't included when that portion of the general plan was developed.
Well,
it was publicly accessible parks.
So right. So the public parks, the element describes all of the open space park recreation, which includes public parks as well as golf courses. When the city established its goals in the recreation open space element, it was, I said, or for every 1,000 residents, you have 5 acres of park space. It also has a goal to have parkland within 1 mile of every residential area. there's a map that we have as part of our general plan recreation element. That's figure 5-1, where we show areas that are deficient that do not meet the 1 mile radius. When we look at the park spaces that are included in that, those are really only public parks. Those do not include golf course lands. So there's deficiencies throughout the city, primarily in the southerly end of the city south of East Palm Canyon, where we have golf course space, but we don't have parkland. So we look at all of these things as part of this document.
And then for the general public, people who've asked about Bel Air Greens, as far as we know, it was through the 1970s and then the 2000, am I correct, general plan updates, where 50% of the land was identified as open space and 50% was zoned for residential for R1C. And that's currently both the general plan and the zoning the underlying zoning was residential, but 50% of it was identified as, in the general plan as in the current general plan and previous general plans as open space.
The 1993 general plan designated the north half of the site as open space parks recreation and the south half as low density residential, 4 units to the acre, which would be consistent with the current zoning on that south half.
And the city didn't put up the current signs that say what the zoning is. That's something that was done by the current owners.
Yes.
So for any confusion on that, that's not something the city did.
The city requires that sign be in. Excuse me. The city has a requirement that a sign be installed for any entitlement application. That is why the applicant installed the sign.
Just clarifying this, I'll come back to your comments now, and then it'll be.
Oh, gee, thanks. Several things. I think we need to add the text that would address Alati land. And then we also had suggestions about cross-referencing the city's landscape ordinance that needs to be done, and adding or clarifying the references to the ownership of the associations, or if they have some different relationship to the golf course, and adding interface with the neighborhood organizations, right? That was some of the comments I've heard from the public that I think we definitely want to.
Yes, and a definition of golf courses that is broad enough to encompass golf courses that have been abandoned.
A couple of things here. I'm glad we have at least, well, like I said, count 2 council members, but the Bel Air Greens is an example of where one of many where we have the city's general plan and the zoning disagree on what the land is. The general plan does take precedence. Back when we did the general plan update in 2007, 2008, it had been planned to update the zoning at that time. However, that was the time of the housing recession. And the money for doing that, which is roughly $1 million, I think, something like that, right? Was taken out of the budget for several years. I think we have that money in the budget coming up, is again my understanding. So I want to congratulate and thank the city council for budgeting that item. That has been an issue for this commission for as long as I've been up here, is the discrepancies between the general plan and the zoning. Finally, I'd like to just raise as a possibility, rather than just handing this up to council, the most effective way I think might be to see if we could establish a study session with the council on this item and the other 2 that are going forward. Those are they're very complex items, and the communication sometimes when we just send something to the council isn't always as good as we'd like it to be. And I think, like we did with the downtown final plan and downtown zoning, this would be a really good time, while we're still considering the final changes to the ordinance, to have such a joint session. And I think I'm going to suggest that don't want to see anybody, two people here cringe, but I think that would be a really good idea because this is very complicated. But that would probably also include the other two items on today's public hearing agenda.
Yes.
The PDD ordinance and the transfer of development rights. Whenever they are ripe, I don't know if we're quite there yet, but we got some more last minute changes to do. I mean, obviously the TDR ordinance has got some work to do, but I think that would be the best way rather than just endorsing this and handing it up. I think a joint session is really called for here.
Just going from that, I'm beginning to hear the shaping of a motion. So let me ask, I'm going to make a motion to approve with changes and ask staff for language. One of the first items was to provide a definition for golf courses that is broad enough to encompass golf courses that are currently non-operational. And I don't know if that's language you would draft after and bring to us, Flynn, or the second is to include the reference, and I didn't get the section in code that Mr. Freeman raised, and maybe you could come up in terms of the landscape ordinance.
Chapter 8.60, I believe.
That is correct. 8.60 of the municipal code, which is the codification, the water efficient landscape ordinance.
Thank you. And then we had, again, at Mr. Freeman's recommendation, we had on section, let's see, page 4, section 2AII, any organization which owns, manages, or represents any residential unit or common area, we basically would probably want to add or represents the neighborhood, so that we include the NORGs. We wanted to include a citywide meeting in the notices, and I'm not sure how that would, something that would be noticed citywide. Is that what you had, Commissioner Woods? Please.
This would be on page 5 of 11. Item 3 is neighborhood outreach meetings. A is how to do it. I'll read the previous sentence so that you get it. These meetings shall be provided to surrounding residents, including renters and occupants and property owners and community associations that are located within 500 feet of any boundary of the subject golf course, period. I'm asking to add after that, a minimum of 1 neighborhood outreach meeting shall be noticed citywide in a format and form approved by the city.
Okay, and I'm assuming that we'll get to comments on this, but Flynn, is that language, and David, is that language that you have?
We'll ask Mr. Woods to forward that language to us just to make sure that we have it correctly as he's indicated.
Then we had language about, and if we can do this within Nexus, that when the development agreement is negotiated, that the Council and Planning Commission make an effort in the development agreement to include access to trails on the public land, to something to that effect, language that we can say. And Mr. Priest, if you can find a variant that would work in that regard.
We will see what we can do on that.
Thank you. And then we talked about a Lot T land, and I'm not sure what we can say on this. The intention is it applies to golf courses that we have the authority to impose these requirements on. So
I believe we could put some language in there to say that this applies to all golf courses in the city, including those on tribal land to the maximum extent allowed by law.
I think
We could do something like
that would be fine. So we would have that language. We don't always know what the maximum extent that it's allowed by law, but
I'm still trying to figure that out right now.
it gets us closer. And the other question is in terms of in the inclusion of waterways. I think we said that waterways would be included in the open space, but I would add the word naturalized waterways. And maybe something that specifically excludes concrete channelized waterways.
We want it to be publicly usable.
Right. Accessible and naturalized waterways would be included in open space.
Could we have that defined as a part of the discretionary review process? Because we have some water channels that are semi-naturalized, like Tahquitz Creek in certain areas, that is useful as recreational space. So it is channelized, but it also is kind of naturalized with rock.
Then we could say waterways that are utilized, that can be utilized as recreational space. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, staff, do you think that would prohibit a concrete channel?
It would ultimately be at the discretion of the Planning Commission and Council.
Seen from Greece.
If we added that language to say.
Well, I'd like to remove it from discretionary.
I think I was not saying they couldn't have a concrete channel. I was saying that wouldn't be included in public or in the definition of the 50% open space.
Right. I'm in agreement with that.
So that's really the definition is what we would count as open space in the 50% definition.
Well, we could modify the development standard F3 open space requirements to put in parentheses after waterways, excluding concrete channels.
So I think those are all of the comments that I heard. Are there other ones that I've missed? Yes.
Well, one thing we want to, when we're talking about applying to fallow golf courses, I think we want to say something like that, where an entitlement has not been already granted, because we definitely don't want this to apply to Serena Park.
Right. We wouldn't want it to apply to Serena Park or to Miralon, where entitlements have been granted.
I mean, we could add some language to that effect, but I think just by operation of law, that would be the case, since they already have their vested entitlement.
I just want to make it clear that we're not going back on those two. Right. It was painful enough to go through them once. One more item that I just had forgotten, and I thought we were going to put this in here. Maybe it's in here somewhere, David, that I can't find. But there needs to be some discussion about it's effectively a previous transfer of development rights or density averaging. At least one golf course that I can think of right in the center of town was built where everything was previously zoned for low-density single-family residences, but the area, some of the areas around the edges of that was then changed to higher-density condominium development, effectively a TDR, transfer of development rights, to allow for the golf course and the higher-density condominium development. That was, we need to have some assessment made of whether there was a commitment to the golf course use in the prior zoning decisions. It's about the best way I can think of saying it. Maybe there's some better words. But if the golf course was approved and then higher density surrounding the golf course had been previously granted, we need to be very careful about changing the golf course, or increasing the density yet again. And maybe on page 4 of 10 of the non-redline version, under section 2, A, and then under the II, somewhere in there, add the assessment of previous zoning decisions and density. So if there was I can't think of the exact words I want to say, and I get Flynn's help, but if there was a previous decision made to increase densities around the golf course by transferring the units that were where the golf course is now to higher density, I think that's something we want to certainly take into consideration.
Yeah, and that's something that you all had brought up previously, and I believe that we have addressed that for the most part, but we'll double check and make sure that
I couldn't find it, but this is getting to be long and complicated.
I had one more, and I don't know. When we get into zoning actions, and it's the development agreement on page 2 of 11, it's under applicability, B2I. And included in this are the provisions that David earlier mentioned, Mr. Newell earlier mentioned we would strike. But under the development agreement, I think it would be good that if there is a in-kind payment or transfer of development rights in accordance with the general plan, that be in the development agreement on a date certain, no later than the issuance of the building permits unless this provision is modified by the City Council. So there's a date certain where there's a requirement that payment or transfer be made. And I think City Council always has the ability, but I think we want to specify that there is a date certain. The intention is that there be a date certain. And I don't have any more changes. Does anybody else have changes? Do people generally agree with where we are with this in terms of the provisions?
Back one more time, or?
We can read it back. The only other thing that was suggested, and my suggestion was that we take a vote on this and then send this to council with the request that we have a meeting with council about this to discuss what we've done and where we've gotten, so that there would be a discussion. We do have our council representative here. I don't, putting you on the spot, Councilmember Middleton, is that something that would be agreeable to the council in your estimation?
I think the council would be, I believe council would be agreeable to that. I am certainly agreeable to taking to council my recommendation, if you vote that way, that we should have a joint study session.
Thank you. So one more, do you want to read back where we are, Flynn? And then, what a task, huh? We're so lucky to have him.
So you have made a motion with the following recommendations as revisions to the draft ordinance. Number one is to include in the definition of golf course any non-operational courses. We've also had a comment about that to exclude any that might already have entitlements, and so we do have that. Secondly was to include references to the water efficient landscape ordinance, and I believe that you had also wanted to add maintenance of the open space as part of that. Number three is relative to section 2A sub 2I about adding language relative to neighborhood organizations as participating in that. Number four is relative to including a citywide meeting in the notices, and that's the language from Commissioner Woods that I'll ask Mr. Woods to forward to us just to make sure that I have that exact language. Number five is relative to the development agreement to encourage access to trails on public lands as part of the Planning Commission City Council negotiations of the development agreement. Number six is to establish in the ordinance the relationship of the ordinance to allotee land. Number seven is relative to waterways that Concrete channelized waterways were not to be included in the open space requirement, but wherever there are recreational amenities adjacent to the waterways, that those could be included in the open space requirement. And then number 8 is in the requirement for a development agreement that there be a date certain for either the payment or the transfer of land relative to the density. And so those were the 8 additional corrections or additions to the ordinance as proposed.
Could you just include the word naturalized under the waterways?
I do have that written down there, so
Okay,
yes, we will include that.
And the date certain was the issuance of building permits unless changed by the council.
Okay.
Anything else? And the exclusion of the items that Commissioner Newell mentioned.
By the way, I'll second that.
Okay, I think Commissioner Newell suggested that we delete on 2 of 11B 3I. Is that just?
Correct. Delete the references to the conditional use permit requirements on lowercase Roman numeral 3 on page 2 of 11 in the strikeout version, and page 6 of 11 D1B. I would also just note a technical correction on that same page, 6 of 11, when we reference under the code section 9323.17 B1B, and on the next paragraph B1A, those should be the reverse. So it should say B1A for D1A, and then for D1B it should say B1B. So it's referencing general plan to general plan and zoning to zoning.
And before we vote on this, I just want to thank Mr. Newell for the tremendous amount of work he's done on this. Call the question? This passes unanimously. Do we need a break before we go to the next item?
Yes.
We'll take a 5-minute break. The meeting is called back to order. We are on item 2C, the City of Palm Springs for a zone text amendment to the Palm Springs zoning code relating to the modification of the Planned Development District Ordinance. Staff report, please.
Madam Chair, what I'd like to do is to turn some time over to Mr. Priest, our attorney, to talk about two issues. As you may recall from our previous discussions on this particular draft ordinance, there were two issues that still needed work. One was relative to public benefit, and the second was relative to revocation procedures. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn that over to Mr. Priest, and then I'll follow with any additional comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission, honorable council member and staff. Yes, as indicated in the staff report, there are two issues that our office has identified in the PDD ordinance that required some alteration, some revision in order to comply with California law. The first, and we've been alluding to it earlier in this meeting in the context of golf course conversions, is public benefit. Yeah, the city does have a public benefit policy. It's been on the books for quite a few years. However, our office had concerns with that public benefit policy because it exceeds nexus. And you know, I've been throwing that word around a lot this afternoon. What does that mean? So let me see if I can try to explain this in a couple of minutes. We start from the premise that I'm a property owner. I have a right to develop my property. It's my property. I get to use it. I own it. The city, although, can come in and impose reasonable development regulations for the benefit of the city. Setbacks, height limitations, all the type of stuff that the commission is very familiar with. In addition to that, we have this, it can be somewhat of a nuanced rule in California called essential nexus. And then it's paired with another concept we have called rough proportionality. And what that basically means is you can regulate my property and how I develop it, height, setback, and all that stuff. But what of my ownership rights can the city actually take? What can it actually, what we call, exact from me as a property owner? And we've come up over the years with these concepts of nexus, proportionality, and what you basically do is when I develop my property, it's going to have certain public impacts on infrastructure, on services, et cetera. You know, with one house or one small property, it would be a very small impact, but you know, if I'm building, 200 houses, an entire subdivision tract, that's going to require additional police, fire, streets, sidewalks, parkland, all of those type of things. And the city has the legal right to take a certain amount of my private property rights as a developer and put that into public ownership to offset those impacts. So for example, I'm building a large tract and we're gonna need to add a street in order to provide reasonable access to that subdivision. The city could say, this portion of property going through your project is not going to be houses, it's going to be a public street. And when it's done, you're going to dedicate that over to the city. That's the legal term we use, is to give it over to public ownership, and the city will operate it, maintain it, et cetera. But again, in order to arrive at that calculation, you need to at least first point to an impact and go, large residential project, it's gonna create access issues that require streets and sidewalks. So those types of things, the city has the legal right to say, yeah, private property owner, we're gonna have that property to solve that impact. We also have impact fees in the city. There is also what's called a development impact fee nexus report that the city did when it adopted those fees. And that determines, hey, how much of new police facilities or new fire facilities or these other type of public infrastructure will this new development create impact for? How much more infrastructure, more services do we need to deal with the impact created by that new development? And it usually is a very lengthy report, gets into a lot of studies and analysis, and then concludes with impact fees that a new house has $550 of fire impact. And so we're going to charge a $550 impact fee to the developer for a building permit to build that one house. And it's a lengthy set of calculations that consultants do to come up with that. At the end of the day, though, it still comes down to, is there an identifiable impact on public services or public infrastructure that development is creating, that in order to offset that, the city needs to take something, needs to take some of that private property right away from the developer. The concern with public benefit is that it acknowledged that there was this nexus limit and then said more. And that was the concern. Because with the exception of a development agreement, which is a negotiated and agreed to contract with the developer, even with PDDs, with any sort of other land use entitlements, the city is limited to this nexus limit. And that's state constitutional. It's actually federally constitutional. It's Fifth Amendment. So that was our concern with the public benefit language as originally drafted. So we have revised that to indicate that the city can require more to the extent that that PDD district with its flexible zoning is creating additional impacts that wouldn't be there if you were just following code. And so that's why we've recrafted the language that way, in order to bring that more into conformity with both US and state constitutional law. The second issue under the PDD ordinance was the automatic termination clause. And I know that we have that in our code for various other permits, and that's something that I'm going to be working with planning about. When a permit is issued, that is a vested, valuable land use entitlement that the developer holds. And now with subdivision maps, there's a special case because there's a state statute that actually time limits those. There isn't one that time limits other land use entitlements like conditional use permits or things like that. And so there's actually a court case out there, it's called the Fort Bragg case, that says that automatic expirations of those types of permits you can't do. If you fail to use the permit within a certain period of time, 1 year, 2 years, whatever your code says, that can be a basis to revoke the permit. But it's not a basis for just automatic revocation. And that's a due process thing. Again, that's constitutional law as well. So the property owner is entitled to notice and to have a hearing before the Planning Commission to, defend, his or her position, and then the commission can make a determination. So it's not really eliminating the standard, it's just sort of a shift in emphasis in the procedure a little bit. Again, if a developer sits on a permit for 2 years and doesn't do anything with it, then that doesn't mean the city just has to let that go on ad infinitum. But what you would do is you would notice that up for a revocation hearing, as opposed to just it's automatically expired. So those are the two key issues that our office noticed in the original Plan Development District Ordinance, and we have made some amendments to that ordinance reflected in here to bring those more consistent with California law.
Certainly. If you'd like to go ahead and ask questions of Mr. Priest now, that would be appropriate. I just have a few comments and I'll...
Go ahead and make the comments first, and then we'll...
There's a couple of things that I just wanted to add to that is in reviewing the memo that came to us from Mr. Priest's office about public benefit, one of the things to take into consideration is that with the proposed changes to the Plan Development District Ordinance, we are permitting much fewer waivers from development standards than existed previously. And so there's going to be a significant limit to what people can ask under the new Plan Development District Ordinance. And so that reduces to a certain degree the public benefit that we would be requesting anyway. Secondly, the development of the small lot ordinance and other changes to our zoning code, for example, changes to mixed use, which is one of the other things that we have on our work plan, also further reduces the need to use the Plan Development District Ordinance. And so I don't anticipate that it will be used as much as it was in the past because we've made changes to the Plan Development District Ordinance and also offered other zoning opportunities for development that wasn't previously available under our code. And so for those reasons, I don't think public benefit is as necessary as it was in the past. because of those limitations that we've placed on it. So I just wanted to make that comment. And then just to go into some additional detail about revocation procedures, one of the questions that has come up is how do we do revocation relative to a planned development district? As you'll note in the draft ordinance, planned development districts are done as a change of zone. And so when the application is approved, it's done by ordinance, and it is noted on the city zoning map that it has been changed to a PD. If, for example, the development does not go forward, then what we would do is we would bring that before the Planning Commission after the time period has expired in a public hearing, as Mr. Priest has indicated, to request to revoke that PD zoning and to change the map back to its original designation. So it doesn't mean that we can't do it any longer. It just means that we have a public hearing process and that we formally notice that as part of the process. As Mr. Priest indicated, we'll need to make, so relative to those 2 points, I just wanted to add those comments, and we'll go ahead and take your questions.
Questions starting with Commissioner Callardine going down.
Yes, on the public benefit, maybe this is a question more for Flynn or something. Do we want to keep the same name for that? Maybe it should be additional mitigation or something like that, since it's no longer what people know as public benefit?
I would suggest that we just keep that the same for now, because we have a history with it. Even though it's not to the extent that it was, it just is a way for us to keep track of the fact that we do have public benefit. Mr. Priest is giving me a look that suggests maybe we do change it, so.
Well, because we've had such public discussion about public benefit, and we're really changing the nature of it, it may be good to give it a different name, Rose by a different name or something like that.
Call it Rosebud or something.
Yeah.
You know what? That's entirely the prerogative of the commission and the council.
Something that
how you'd like to do that.
When I was thinking, which occurs very rarely these days, but I thought maybe we would want to do. On page 8 of the draft ordinance, redline version, item 3, public benefit. The first line under general, where you added to offset any additional impacts specifically created by the waivers of development standards requested under this section. Could we change that wording to be to offset any additional impacts created by the project? I'm changing the baseline here.
I suppose we could do that. The project inherently is going to be subject to Nexus and the ability to exact, public improvements and services out of the project. I mean, that's already constitutional law.
I think isolating the impacts created by the changes in the zone or the changes in the PDD versus the changes caused by the project, and I think particularly under CEQA where the no project is the baseline, we might want to change that language to use the project as the baseline rather than the.
Okay.
We
can certainly look at that. I think the intent at the time was we're focused on PDD. Public benefit has this concept of being that added thing.
Well, I kind of see maybe now it's become, okay, what is the mitigation that our additional mitigation that all our standard requirements missed?
Well, it's not that our requirements wouldn't miss anything. It's that if you took a project and developed it to code, we're not asking for any flexible zoning, anything. There's so many fees and so much property that the city could get from that project to offset those impacts, to mitigate those impacts. Now I come in with a PDD. That's going to change the zoning some, and to the extent that adds impacts that normally wouldn't be there for a to-code project.
I understand that. I just would like to change it to project because I think distinguishing the changes from the zone, let's call it the zone change, is going to be very tricky and require a lot of technical analysis we won't have, where we will already have all the analyses for the project itself.
You're asking questions, but you're also going far afield before the public hearing.
Okay.
So I want to limit you to questions.
All right, can I do that?
I have some ideas.
Okay.
I could discuss them with the commission now, or I could discuss
Let's
them
discuss
later.
it later, I guess, under ideas.
We'll wait until the public hearing to discuss
Then I have
it.
one more question, and this is definitely a question, in the format of a question. On the termination question for the PDD, and I guess now the CUP, how would this affect the termination of the other project actions like the tentative map and stuff like that?
The Subdivision Map Act creates a special case for tentative maps. By statute, those tentative maps, unless they're a vesting map, those tentative maps are good for 2 years and then they expire, unless you can get them extended by the city. There you have explicit statutory authorization of something that automatically expires, and the courts have upheld that. And so in that special case with tentative maps, yeah, you are coming back to the Planning Commission for extensions, or if there's statutory extensions like there were for many years during the development slump and the recession. But all the other land use entitlements, such as CUPs, variances, zone changes, stuff like that, those are things that don't automatically expire. Due process requires that those come back to the commission or the council for a revocation. So
Another question here. Would that leave us with a situation where the tentative maps have expired, but the PDD has not?
Possibly. It's been known to happen where, you know, development is a four-legged stool, and if one of the legs gets knocked out, you know, you got to put that leg back up before it works again.
Wasn't that, Madam Chair, some of the issues with Crescendo and Boulders?
Yes.
And that's, sorry if I could jump in, Madam Chair, that's one of the specific things that the subcommittee requested, is that we time the entitlements so that they expire together, so that one isn't extended beyond what the others are. So what I'd recommend that we do is, Mr. Priest, if we could just look at that language to make sure that we're still there relative to the expiration of the entitlements, where there are multiple entitlements associated with a planned development district.
Are there questions of staff for the other commissioners? Commissioner Hirschbein?
So just to clarify, under normal development, under a normal development project where you're complying with the underlying zoning, there's certain extractions that are legal, like you mentioned, for public roads or sewers, or easements, or whatever. And now we're saying that in a PDD, the only time we can this is a question. I'm trying to clarify what you're saying in my mind. You're saying the only quote unquote public benefit we can further extract has to do with an added burden above the underlying zoning.
Yes.
So, for instance, in the past we've had PDDs that have decreased the amount of allowable units in a particular tract or site. So in that case, you would say that there is no additional public benefit you could extract from the developer. Is that correct?
As a general rule,
he gets the credit.
Wait, let me just...
Please.
As a general rule, if no additional impacts are created by the flexible zoning, then there would be no basis to do additional exactions. There would be no additional.
And if there was additional impact, wouldn't that be covered under the normal taking anyway, regardless of calling it a public benefit or not? I mean, to me, it sounds like we don't even need a public benefit portion in this ordinance if we can only extract what's extractable under typical circumstances.
Let me offer a thought. You know, one of the things that still remains as being a waiver that could be requested is internal setback requirements in a planned development district. And so the public benefit might be something to offset the impacts of that, where you're reducing the separation between buildings or reducing yard space, that you might require something comparable elsewhere. And so, again, I think there is still room for some type of public benefit above and beyond the normal requirements, but they would have to be based specifically on the type of waiver requested and the impacts of that waiver.
Commissioner Hirschman, I know where you're going with this.
Really? Because I don't. So why don't you tell me?
I understand your question to be, you know, hey, if it's all exactions and nexus anyway, you know, why are we specifically calling this out? I think it's useful to at least call this out in the ordinance to make it clear that, you know, nexus still applies. If there's additional impacts, we can offset those. Just as a clarifying point, but I would agree with you that, yeah, I mean, you know, whether we call it public benefit or if it's just an exaction from a project that has nexus, it's the same concept at the end of the day. It's a specifically identifiable impact on public facilities or services caused by the development. There's a clear offset to deal with that.
But that's already...
You're right, that's already law.
Embedded in all of our development.
True, true. I think, though, it's useful to have this language in here just to clarify.
And getting back to your example, again, in the past, we've done these small lot subdivisions, for instance, on typically R3 or commercial zone, and we don't really have any applicable setback standards that you could then transfer to these smaller lot subdivisions. So even in that case, would you still be able to say that, for instance, requiring a common little green area or a dog park or something would be a nexus in that case?
If you can specifically tie that back to the waiver that's being requested, then yes. If there is some need for some type of common space for residents, then yes, you could require either a park or a dog park or something like that.
Okay.
Maybe I can give an example. Sorry. Giving an example from parks, because that's the one that tends to cause the most challenges for a lot of cities. You have a project, and say it's got, when it's all said and done, it's got 20 acres of open space left on the property. The city has done its calculations based on the number of people who are going to be moving into this project and stuff, the 5 per 1,000 standard the city's general plan has adopted. And the conclusion is that we have nexus to collect 6 acres for a park. The city could say, as a condition of your permits, hand over 6 acres. It will be dedicated as a public park, you know, located on the corner or located somewhere where it's accessible. But what do you do with the other 14 acres? The other 14 acres is still the developer's property. And if they want to, now if it's regulated to be open space or parkland or something like that, the city could still require it to be open space or parkland, but it would be privately owned open space or parkland. So it could be an HOA park, it could be a pool house, it could be those kinds of things, not publicly accessible. So that's the distinction there. You have nexus to maybe get some of the property into a public park, which again would be publicly accessible. It's how most city parks get developed, is they get an exaction from a developer that built, you know, KB, Lennar, you know, a lot of these big developers. They would reserve a section of land in the project, and it's like that's going to be Smith Park or Jones Park or something like that. But you may not be able to get all of the property under a public benefit theory, because again, you still have to point to an impact, and you need to show that that taking is proportional. That's the other element of it. When you do impact fee studies, very lengthy reports, and it gets into all of that stuff. So you come with a fair number of, this is what we're going to charge new development for police, fire, streets, general government. There's a whole slew of them that get charged under impact fee law. I hope that makes sense.
So you're talking public benefit, so you're not really talking site plan in this in terms of, and which I don't think fits into public benefit. So when we've approved small residential developments and we include a swimming pool and a dog park for the residents, that isn't a public benefit that has been assessed. That's a portion of the site plan that goes into the development.
Yes, that's a very important legal distinction too, is your authority to regulate private property is more extensive than your ability to take private property for a public use. You can still regulate and say, yeah, developer, it's still your property. We're not taking it into public ownership, but you will still be limited on height. You will be limited on setback. You will be limited on these things.
Okay, so let me just posit another example. So, because another example, there's a site that's zoned commercial, and a developer wants to develop residential on that property, and he wants to do it through a PDD. And that site borders a natural path that's owned by, for instance, a water district that people use for recreational purposes. Can you, under the public benefit part of that, can you require that the developer provide a landscape buffer within his own property before the development part of it begins?
Depending on the type of buffer, I would say yes. Reasonable buffers are required in projects all the time. And I think you could do that. Again, you would have to point to a specific impact. But again, if the impact is houses too close to a natural open space place, so we want a buffer, yeah, you could probably justify a buffer. But again, it's a matter of degree. It's a matter of proportionality. And so that's where it just gets a little tricky, especially if you're going on a case-by-case basis, because you really have to look at each case. When we do impact fees, our attempt is to come up with an across-the-board rule for everybody.
Right.
But some of these, like dedication of a buffer or, reserving a buffer that would still be privately owned but not developed, again, those are things you really take on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you.
Other questions? I have a couple. One is when we get to the question that on public benefits, the developers shall identify, is there any reason to say, and the staff shall confirm?
What?
I assume you guys confirm those.
Yes, we would. I'm trying to look and see where you are.
It's section C on page 9 of, it's public benefits C, and the applicant shall be responsible for identifying requested waivers, their impact on public infrastructure and services, and the accompanying public benefit that will offset the impact.
Okay.
The question I have, and we're not through the public hearing, but there's no reason not to put language in there about staff confirmation.
Okay.
And then a question for Mr. Priest, and I already know the answer, but you've deleted all the sustainable features which are over and above what would be in the 2020 sustainability guidelines. And does that mean that we need to look, some of them are, and they would pertain only to commercial buildings, things like LEED certification for commercial buildings, are those things we need to put into the, into our zoning and our general requirements? I'm just concerned that we have no way of requiring what many other jurisdictions now require or reward.
Yeah, one of the reasons, and it was actually me who took this out based on the memo from Mr. Priest's office, looking at the fact that the public benefit has to address the specific impacts of the waivers being requested, that it didn't seem that sustainable features would necessarily address that. And then secondly, because of recent advancements that we as the city have made, such as adopting our solar policy and changes in Title 24 that are forthcoming, that it didn't seem like this language was really necessary any longer. Now,
Does Title 24, though, apply to commercial buildings?
Yes.
And so that we're coming closer to what LEED Platinum or LEED Silver used to be?
Yeah, we certainly are here in the state of California. So I don't know that this language is necessary any longer, and if it really serves the purpose of being a public benefit, again, because of other changes that we've made elsewhere.
And Mr. Priest, is there anything in the way of sustainability items that could be public benefit in these guidelines? Does everything under sustainability need to be excluded?
Yeah, I tend to concur with Flynn that it would be difficult to demonstrate a specific project impact that you would use sustainability features for to specifically offset, again, Title 24 code compliance, an improvement of design standards to have more sustainable features. That's all fine, and the city has the legal authority to adopt that through building codes and all that stuff. But on a project-specific basis, it's a little bit of a challenge for me to just figure out how a sustainable building practice will offset an identifiable impact of new development to the city.
An identifiable impact of new development is that you're using water that would otherwise stay in the aquifer. That's the. I mean, I can see, and I'm throwing that out not to be difficult.
I understand.
But every newspaper article I read where people are concerned about a new development somewhere in the valley, they're concerned about impacts on the sustainability of our water source.
Understood. And there's a network of laws already in existence that assist with water sustainability. Having to evaluate, the water sufficiency of the site before you get approvals, before you get maps and all that type of stuff. Impact fees. I'm assuming the city does have water system impact fees. If not, let's talk. If not, let's talk, because that's a very common way that water sustainability impacts are addressed, is you have a water system impact fee. That goes into a fund that builds new water capacity, new systems. They do it for sewer, wastewater, all of that stuff as well. Groundwater augmentation charges, which the courts have blessed in the last couple of years, where you can charge as part of your water bill, the city can charge additional money that's necessary to recharge the groundwater so the aquifer doesn't get overdrafted. There are a number of ways that cities can do that. All I'm saying is it's a little bit of a challenge for me to find, in my mind at this moment, a specific public benefit offset for that impact. I'm not saying it's impossible, it's just different avenues for doing that, for addressing that.
Just looking, I mean, I can think of ways that it might, requiring pool covers, given that you have 100 new pools coming in and pools evaporate. But are those things you want to generally require and we couldn't specifically require? Is that what you're saying?
It's something I want to look into a bit more. At first blush, having a pool covering requirement, that might pass Nexus, just thinking about it off the top of my head, to ensure that water's not, evaporating. You live in a desert climate out here, and that's obviously a greater concern than if you were living at the coast. Again, it's something I'd like to look into. At first blush, it might pass muster under Nexus. A requirement like that, yeah.
And that's the only question, is that if we're looking at offsets, that every possible environmental thing is excluded, which doesn't seem to fit the harshness of our climate. And
at the end of the day, defending exactions are all about really two things: being able to point to the impact and then be able to point to the offset. That's ultimately, how you defend an exaction.
And then my other question is, maybe you or Flynn could go through the revocation process, what that would look like step by step, where we have a combination of a project with a final track map and a PD that doesn't get built out. What does that what does that look like? When does, so we've, that's the concern I have is what are the different permutations of revocation of a PD that we need to consider that impact the decisions we're making here or the additions we're making here?
You know, again, it's really just sort of a shift in procedure more than anything else. You have a developer that's, you know, gone past 2 years or 1 year, whatever the cutoff is in your code. Staff could flag that, identify that, and then they would notice that up for a revocation hearing before the Planning Commission. And then the Planning Commission would hear the item. It's literally that simple. As opposed to the applicant coming to you for an extension, it would come to you on a revocation, and then the property owner would be present and could explain, you know, hey, what have you been doing? You know, have you been utilizing your entitlements or not?
So would that be combined with an extension request? So we would have somebody come for both a revocation and an extension, and staff would suggest one or the other?
Again, I don't mean to get all semantic here.
No, I'm just trying to figure out what we're looking at.
Yeah, technically,
or the future commission is looking at.
Understood. Technically, it would not be an extension. It would, because under the Fort Bragg case, the entitlement just keeps going on with the land. It's not a matter of extending it or not. It just runs with the land until revoked. So instead of coming before the commission to keep an entitlement going, it would be coming to the commission to stop an entitlement that can effectively just keep running on its own. Does that make sense? Maybe that's a little confusing.
Let me offer another example. Let's say that we have a planned development district application, a major architectural application, and a subdivision map. Those are approved by City Council, and they're given 2 years to develop. In that 2 years, they don't develop, so they request an extension of time, which comes before the Planning Commission. Planning Commission gives them a 1-year extension of time. They come back in 1 year, they still haven't developed. They request another extension of time, and Planning Commission says, no, we're not going to approve your extension of time. So you deny the extension of time application, and then you would direct staff to follow up with revocation procedures. And so at your next Planning Commission meeting, at a notice public hearing, we would then hear the revocation of those items. So that's an example of how it might work. So we wouldn't hear them together, they would be? It would be, we would take action on the extension of time, and once the extension of time is either denied or it runs out, then we would do the revocation proceedings.
Okay. Thank
so
you.
That's how that would work.
Yeah,
Are there more questions? I'm sorry I dragged this out.
Yeah, the Fort Bragg case is actually pretty narrow in its scope at the end of the day. It's really just no automatic terminations. That's really what it is.
And would that apply to also major architectural applications? And so that we'll have more work to do on, there'll be more hearings.
Unfortunately, it will be more work for staff, but I think it will ultimately result in less questions in terms of the status of projects.
What would happen if the entitlement holder did not approach the city for an extension? Would the city have to proactively revoke it? And how are you going to keep track of that?
Well, all I can tell you is what the courts say. You know, making that administratively happen can be a bit of a challenge. But in order to comply with the Fort Bragg case, that's really what would have to happen. We'd have to have a tickler file, a tracking file, something like that.
And let me add to that our IT department is actively investigating a automatic permitting system or electronic permitting system. Okay. And so I have great faith that once we have that in place, we would be able to track those types of things.
And is Fort Bragg a California Supreme Court precedent, a federal Supreme Court precedent?
It's a California Court of Appeal case. It's Community Development Commission of Mendocino County versus City of Fort Bragg.
And so is it binding on the city, given that it's a California Court of Appeals and hasn't been, was it appealed to our Supreme Court and not
I don't remember if they tried to get review at the Supreme Court. What I can tell you is, even though it's a single Court of Appeal case, it's the only one of its kind officially on the books. And unless a separate Court of Appeal comes up with a different opinion, which they haven't in 30 years, it's binding on everybody in the state.
Got it. Any more questions? Can I open the public hearing?
Sorry.
Yes.
Mr. Callardine.
Under item C of determination of public benefit, on the red line version, it's page 9. The down about the, well, again, the red line version, it's the sentence that begins, the applicant shall be responsible for identifying the requested waivers, their impact on public infrastructure and or services. Would it be possible to broaden that? I'll make sure this is a question.
Is this, I don't think this is a question.
I'm just asking, is it possible to broaden that, or what does that limit? I'm thinking about environmental setting impacts to that really aren't, are they included in there?
I would consider any sort of environmental amenities of the city to be public infrastructure. So to the extent there is an impact on, public infrastructure that preserves the environment,
What about the preservation of views is the thing I'm thinking right there. But with the elimination of setbacks or reduction of setbacks, there might be changes to views.
That becomes a bit different. When you're dealing with views, you can certainly regulate private property for that. I'm trying to come up with a situation where
let's
you
just
would
think about it, and then when we get
like take a public view easement or something like that. I'm not sure where we would go with that, but
let's open the public hearing and come back to that issue. The public hearing is open. Is there anyone from the public who would like to speak?
Again, I want to say I agree with Commissioner Hirschbein about the public benefit title. Basically, the public in general doesn't even see these benefits. So I really don't think it does need to be called that. And just the other thing is, anything we can do to limit the PDDs, please. We've had so many PDDs in the city, it's ridiculous. But other than that, good job.
Is there anyone else in the public who would like to speak?
My name is Julie Salazar, and thanks everybody for all the work that you do for us. While sitting here, something came to mind. The other day I was driving past Bilardo, and against the mountain, I noticed there was a bike rack. I think it's part of the PDD, I'm not sure. That's why I hesitated in coming up. But it was a tiny little space. So my question is, how little can the landowner offer the community and call it a park? Because it was a small bench, a bike rack, and I saw a water fountain, but it could have been larger because I was driving by. But I thought, that's kind of an unusual place for that. So my question again is there a minimum requirement for an owner of property to call it a park? Or is it just a gesture? It seems to me like there should be some kind of way of measuring the...
We can't answer that while you're commenting, but we can take it up when we...
Oh, okay. That's it. Thank you again.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? If not, the public hearing is closed and this matter is before the commission. You're referring to the Dakota project. That was a section of land that was offered by the applicant to the city, and I believe it is a city park for people who bike past to stop and get water. And it's a trailhead It's, I won't say any, I let your comments stand. I don't, we had the same questions. This is before us. Comments on things that have been, questions that have been raised, or general comments. There's a history to this that people may or may not know, that the PD's a special ad hoc committee was set up through a lawsuit on the Dakota project, and it met for about a year. It had representatives from the Planning Commission, from the developer, from the people who sued the Dakota, and then we added 3 people, and we came up with a series of recommendations that are included in the packet. This is for commissioners that are new. The group itself recommended about 60 changes, but they, including the people who'd been involved in the lawsuit, took the position that we should continue the PD process, but really circumscribe it and limit it. So that's what's before us today. The one thing that is a significant limitation is that the PD process can no longer be used for a single housing type. It's basically when you're combining different kinds of property. So the PD would no longer be utilized, if this is approved by us and the council, for a project like the Dakota. And we have in front of us later today for comment a small lot subdivision proposal that would take the place of doing that. So that's one of the limitations that Flynn mentioned, is that we are recommending, if we pass this, we're recommending to council that we no longer create single-family subdivisions through a PD process, but that it go through a regular zoning process. So I think that maybe Flynn, because the public's listening, I think that's the major limitation, but you might want to just let the public know it's very severely limited in terms of what it would currently be used for. It would be used if somebody wanted to put 2 different commercial uses together, or in the downtown area, they would be using a PD process. If somebody wanted to build affordable housing, they might be utilizing the plan development process. And if they were putting together, I think the one project that we currently have that might be a PD, and I always call it the Rock Garden Project, even though I know that's not the name, where it had multifamily along the street front on Palm Canyon and single-family housing in the back. It was a multiple housing type. Something like that could still be done, but it would be limited. And things like the Morrison, the Vibe, the Vibe might be possible because it had 2 different kinds of housing. The Morrison, Soul, other projects would not come through a PD.
And if I might just add to that, you know, some of the projects, for example, Vibe, might be able to come in if we go forward with the small lot ordinance. The Vibe might be able to come in under the small lot ordinance for the single family product, and then the multifamily product could be under our standard R2, R3 zoning. So there still is the possibility for some of these projects, but they would need to conform to either the new small lot district or the existing multifamily districts as a way to do that. But you're correct in that the proposed changes to the Plan Development District Ordinance do significantly limit the waivers that would be permissible. The recommendations are that perimeter setbacks need to be maintained, the height limits of the underlying zoning district need to be maintained, and other similar standards, minimum open space requirements, that needs to be maintained. And so that reduces significantly the number of waivers that are possible. Two of the things that still would be eligible under the Plan Development District ordinance, though, is the development of affordable housing. That has been added as one of the purposes of Plan Development District, is to accommodate that. And then secondly, where we have the preservation of natural areas, that's another way that I see the Plan Development District being used, is to preserve natural areas by grouping housing or clustering housing. And so those are some of the ways that we might still see it be used. But again, it's going to be greatly reduced under the proposed regulations that we have.
So with that sort of as an introduction, Commissioner Woods?
First of all, I want to really commend Mr. Priest for bringing the issue before us, keeping us out of trouble, and keeping this moving forward. We've reviewed it many, many times. I think there is a complete validity to keeping PDDs and flexible zoning. I'll call it flexible zoning. And I think there was just an article in Curb LA about flexible zoning and the benefits that it can provide. I think our Flynn had just given us a couple of examples of the benefits that we could achieve as a city by using a PDD ordinance like this that we've come before. We've also heard a lot of public testimony on this, and we've done a lot of revisions to it to get to the point where we are today. So I applaud everyone who's been a part of that process. With that, I would actually like to make a motion to approve it with the following changes that I've heard from my fellow commissioners. All of the changes are on page 9. The first change is page 9C. In front of the word waivers, just add projects, possessive, the projects waivers requested. I think the term waivers is still a very important thing to have in there because it's proportionality, and the understanding of waivers is very important to that. The only other two, and then further down in the red line version, I think to our chairs thing, a staff confirmation of the public benefit. To add that, the wording of that could be flexible, how staff sees. And then my own two would be on items D3 and 4, just to add public art in both of those, whether on-site or off-site. Adding public art, I think, is a public benefit. And with that, I would make a motion to approve.
Second.
I have one, just one.
I have one change.
One change before you get there, which is the very last section, and it's just a rewording on controlled access with gates. Page 13, number E. And it would just be to change the order of the wording so that we say controlled access is discouraged, will interrupt existing street grid, controlled access to development shall only be approved by the Planning Commission, and put that first, and then if there is a request, what it would entail. So we emphasize the fact that we don't, that it's public access, that controlled access will be limited. If that's, is that acceptable to you?
And Madam Chair, if I might just add one more thing. Commissioner Callardine had requested on page 8 under 3A that under the underlined portion, offset any additional impacts specifically created by the project rather than by waivers. He had wanted us to investigate that. If you might ask if that's acceptable to the motion maker.
Page
8.
Could I just suggest a little language to that really quickly?
I don't want to get rid of the word waivers because.
Oh no, I'm not.
Because it was very specific from the subcommittee that they wanted that language.
If I may suggest, Madam Chair, revising that first sentence to say, each application for a planned development district shall require the provision of public benefit to offset any impacts of the project, comma, including those additional impacts specifically created by waivers of the development standards required under this section. Is that acceptable to the commission?
Yes, that's acceptable.
Is that acceptable to you?
Yes, I was.
I just want to say, I've been involved in preservation for 20 years in this city, and the Planned Development District has been the bane of our existence in the, not just for historic resources, but for developments that just seem like they were inappropriate, and they all fell under this PDD. So I understand the public's concern about it, and I think this addresses it, and you've worked on it for a long time. And I think ultimately when the public realizes the effect of this new ordinance, they will be very pleased, because you have put in a huge amount of effort to deal with all the issues that were related to the abuses of the process. So I think I strongly support the motion to approve.
Can we call, if there are no more comments or no more changes, can we call the question? And then this passes unanimously. Can we add this to the items that we would discuss with the City Council? If they're willing to meet with us, we would do it at the same time that we did the golf course conversion ordinance. Okay.
Madam Chair, I need to excuse myself 1 minute, and I'll be right back.
We'll take a 5-minute break while we're waiting. To order. We have a discussion item on 3A. This is not a public hearing item. The discussion of the proposed small lot residential zone. Planning Director's report, please.
Madam Chair and members of the Commission, the City Council, the Planning Commission has had a subcommittee studying the small lot issue for a number of years. We have gone through a number of iterations on proposed small lot standards. One of the things that we discovered is that as we got deeper into the issues, that the proposed draft ordinance was becoming overly complicated, and we wanted to simplify things. And so we kind of went back to what the purpose of the small lot ordinance was. Number one, to develop an alternative to the Plan Development District process and provide codified standards in our code for small lot development. Secondly, to allow something smaller than our current smallest lot district, the R1D, which has a minimum lot size of 7,500 square feet. And then third was really to maintain the character of our community, that if we do allow small lots, it needs to be something that's appropriate to the character of Palm Springs, rather than other things that you've heard today about becoming Orange County. That's certainly something that we want to avoid. And so going back to the purpose, that's what we were looking at with the small lot ordinance. One of the things that came to us as we had gone through several different iterations of the proposed ordinance was looking at precedent right here in Palm Springs for small lot development. We have the Vista Santa Rosa subdivision, which is located south of Ramon, north of Camino Paracela, and then just immediately to the east of Indian Canyon Drive. And it's actually a wonderful little subdivision that has small homes that have a great scale, great character, and it's really a good place to study as precedent for a small lot ordinance here in Palm Springs. If you look at the particulars of the subdivision, the lot size is between 5,000 and 6,000 square feet. Each of the lots are about 100 feet deep. The lots vary between 50 to 60 feet in width. Height of the residences in the district, 1 story. And then the street width, it uses our standard street grid where the right-of-way is 60 feet wide. The actual width of the pavement is 36 feet, and so that leaves you on either side of the pavement for sidewalks. However, you will note in this neighborhood that there are very few sidewalks there currently. But again, we looked at that as a precedent for perhaps a small lot ordinance. And so what we've developed and what we are proposing to you today is to look at a proposed R1E zone where it would have a lot size of 5,000 square feet as a minimum, and it would basically bridge the gap between the existing R1D ordinance, which has a minimum lot size of 7,500 square feet. And so with this new zone, you would see lots between 5,000 and 7,500 square feet. Just to give a little bit of greater flexibility in the development of lots under this ordinance, we would propose a minimum depth of 90 feet, a minimum width of 50 feet for interior lots and 55 feet for corner lots. In terms of lot coverage, we looked at a number of different iterations of that and came up with a preference for a maximum lot coverage of 45%. We also looked briefly at allowing a 2-story house in the R1E district, but ultimately came back to respecting the character and scale of development of Palm Springs and have limited that to 1 story. And then in terms of street width, we would just rely on the general plan requirement, which for local streets has a minimum width of 50 feet to 60 feet. And then being able to do the pavement and sidewalks within that right-of-way width. There's a couple of exceptions that we would allow in the R1E zone that isn't applicable to other single-family zoning districts in Palm Springs. Number one is because of the lot width to allow tandem parking situations, tandem garages. Secondly, one of the recommendations of this subcommittee is to allow 0 lot line configurations so that you could do a shared use easement and gain more usability of the side yards for the development. And the third was to encourage outdoor spaces by allowing covered porches to be exempt from the lot coverage requirements. As I had mentioned, we went through a number of different iterations of looking at what the setbacks and the lot coverage would do in terms of the resulting square footage of the residences. So here you have three examples of a 50-foot wide lot, a 60-foot wide lot, and a 70-foot wide lot. So 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 square feet. Using setbacks of 15 feet to the front of the house and a 20-foot setback to the garage, 6-foot side yard setbacks and a 15-foot rear yard setback. This is what the resulting lot coverage would result in terms of the house size. And so you can see house sizes of 1,800 square feet in the smallest example, up to 2,700 square feet in a larger lot under the R1E district. In your packet, I provided you with examples of floor plans that would be possible under the R1E zoning district standards, looking at two different developers here within the Coachella Valley. And so as you look at those floor plan examples, what it does is provides you with a sample of the fact that homes developed under this would still have all of the standard amenities that we would expect for single-family development, that you're still going to get a fairly reasonable home size in terms of its square footage. And so even though the 45% lot coverage might seem somewhat restrictive, and the one-story height limit might seem restrictive, it does give us a rather generous housing product. So I think it would still be successful as we are proposing it. In terms of the implementation of the R1E zoning district, how would that occur? The city would not go out and rezone properties to R1E. Rather, property owners would submit an application to file a change of zone to R1E. The second aspect of that is it would need to be consistent with the underlying general plan. And so based on the square footage, it would either be the low-density residential for the larger lot size, the 7,000 square foot lots, or medium-density residential for the smaller lot sizes under the ordinance, the 5,000 and 6,000 square foot lots. So generally, you're going to be ranging from about 5 dwelling units to the acre to about 7.5 dwelling units to the acre. And so again, the change of zone would need to be consistent with the existing underlying residential zoning on the property. That concludes my comments. Just in terms of our next steps, we have this before you as a discussion item today. If you are ready to move forward after your discussion today, we would do that as a notice public hearing at a regularly scheduled planning commission meeting, finalize the draft, and then we would forward that to the city council. As has been discussed earlier today, I think that would be appropriate to do it at a study session with the Plan Development District Ordinance and the Golf Course Conversion Ordinance. So again, that concludes my comments, and I'd be happy to take your questions and your comments.
Starting with Commissioner Woods and coming down.
Are we doing questions or are we doing comments?
You can
both.
You can do both. This is at this point we don't have a public hearing.
Great. I applaud the effort, and I applaud the effort because I think, as we heard before, we have seen PDDs where we walk in and they're bad examples, and all we saw was garage door after garage door after garage door. I don't think that's a great urban form that we want to repeat. I would prefer, instead of a solid 15-foot setback, varied setbacks with an average of 15 feet. So one could be set back more, one could be set back less, but that they could be varied. I would also like to see something where parking is in the rear, the old-fashioned ones where the driveways was along the side of the house and you parked in the back, and or maybe alleyways. Alleyways take up land space, so developers may not want to give that up, but where you park off the alleyway versus park off of the street, and then make these streets much more walkable for people. And I think the lot coverage of 45%, we could incentivize it to be even less than 45% with certain features. It could be an alleyway as a feature, or a covered veranda as a feature for a spool, which is a cross between a pool and a spa in the back. And I think some incentives for trying to get the urban form that I think we're trying for here, which is a walkable, condensed neighborhood, we could achieve that with just some tweaks to the ordinance as written.
in greater Los Angeles, I thought 50 by 100 lots is standard, not considered small. I mean, almost all of Los Angeles is 50 by 100. And on those lots, they have built, you know, those small apartment buildings over the years, which we're not going to allow. The question I have is, if the maximum lot coverage is 45%, there, you know, we do have a housing crisis, and in Los Angeles now, they're starting to look at these granny flats at the rears of the property, because a lot of times there's very small houses in the front and open land in the back, and they're allowing small houses to be built there. So I'm just wondering why we would want to restrict it to 45% if we're trying to also address the housing crisis. Maybe members of the commission or committee could.
I don't remember considering auxiliary dwelling units. I think it's a good goal, but I think the 45% is important to maintain our less dense environment here than Los Angeles. And if you wanted to do an auxiliary dwelling unit, we could come up with language that would allow that, but I think that would necessitate reducing the size of the main dwelling unit, because right now what Flynn is showing us is really dwelling units that maximize out the 45% for just the main dwelling unit. But if you wanted to include an auxiliary dwelling unit, I think you'd have to reduce the main dwelling unit by that amount.
Is that possible? Is this something that could be?
Yeah, I certainly think that's something that we could consider. What we could play with is maybe looking at something of 45% where there's just a single-family residence. If there's an accessory dwelling unit, we might bump up the lot coverage to 50% as a way,
the size of the main house.
And reduce the size of the main house. So that's something that we can certainly look at it when we come back to you in a public hearing setting.
So, a friend of mine is going through this in Los Angeles, so he was telling me about some of the requirements. In Los Angeles, you're not allowed to attach to the main house for the auxiliary dwelling unit. I'm not sure what the reasoning behind that is. I wouldn't be opposed to.
Yeah, I think actually state law with the recent changes to the requirements on accessory dwelling units that we have to allow them to be either attached or detached.
You have to allow them to be attached?
Yeah. So I think we have to allow both forms.
We have an accessory dwelling unit ordinance, don't we?
We do, but it needs to be updated to reflect the changes in state law, and that's going to be coming to you, I think, in your second meeting in October.
And it should be tailored to the smaller lots as well, I think.
Okay.
I think both suggestions are good. I think allowing some flexibility in terms of the setbacks, especially the front yard setbacks, so things can be a little more offset, and with an average of 15 feet in a subdivision is a good idea. The 45-50 for the accessory dwelling units makes sense. Where we're trying to get to address the housing crisis is that in the past we've been building most of our single small lot subdivisions on R2, R3, and R4 land. And this would free that land up for actually getting some kind of multifamily on it, as opposed to condensed single-family houses. So I love what you've done with this. I think it's elegant and simple. I'm not sure about the alleyways, because they do take up more land, and I don't think we have any tradition of alleyways at all in Palm Springs. I grew up with one, in a housing unit that had that, but nobody parked. In Chicago, they come in through the alleys and they park in the back of their garage, but I don't know what that would do here. I mean, it would make it more walkable, but it would reduce. It would sort of offset the reduction in the size of the lot.
What we can do is we can work with engineering to see how we might be able to make alleys work. One of the thoughts that comes to mind is in our general plan under local streets, if we can reduce the right-of-way requirement where alleys are provided, that might be one of the ways to achieve that goal. So let me do some additional work on that and see what we might be able to come back with.
It'd be nice not to park to have to park in the front.
Yeah.
if I'm out of turn, but Venice offers a lot of examples of that are quite magical in many, many ways. And since this is a very specific ordinance to try and get a very specific housing type, you could look there. Santa Monica also has several.
And Santa Monica actually has that as a tradition. A lot of their neighborhoods have alleys.
Right, and narrower streets that don't necessarily have parking on them all the time or in every location.
I wonder if Flynn could explain to us, first off, what does the state override do on the accessory unit? I know that they override our zoning somehow, right? Or do they tell us what we have to do with that?
There are certain requirements in terms of allowing accessory dwelling units, in terms of the size of the units, the configuration of the units, parking requirements, and things like that. So you will see coming forward, again, as I had mentioned, probably your second meeting in October, we'll have some revisions to the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, which spells out the changes that are required in state law.
One other comment here. A lot of the original opposition or the creation for this activity was that some people objected to Seoul and Dakota, which were actually small lot developments because we created legally a separate lot for each home. Another way you could do the same thing, it would look the same, would be to use R2, R3 zoning, which is what they were doing, and create a condo lot for each home, which functionally, legally I know it has a lot of differences, but functionally it looks just the same. And we did that with the Icon development up on North Palm Canyon, where we have, again, almost identical to Seoul and Dakota, these small lots, I think they're about 5 to 10 feet apart, something like that physically. They're not actual lots, they're condo lots, and that's a major legal distinction, but for practical purposes, it's, the result is the same. And I still think we're not doing yet what you're kind of indicating is getting rid of that option, because they can come back through the R2, R3 zoning as condominiums. And I think that's actually a good idea that they do that, because I still like some of that product. Not everyone does, I recognize that. And I'd rather see us also take a little bit of look at the R2, R3 standards and see how they would accommodate that type of unit, or we're going to be right back where we started from, because everybody's going to go that way just like the Icon people did. And that came out of some discussions that we had here, where why aren't you calling it condominiums rather than small legal lots?
If I might just add on to Commissioner Callardine's comments, in looking at that as an example, another one that we saw last summer was Enclave at Baristo, which was developed under our multifamily zoning development standards. They actually looked like a small lot product, but they were attached at the back of the units, and they maintain the 15-foot separation distance between the units that's required in our R2 and R3 zoning districts. And so they conform to all of the development standards of a multifamily zoning district, and yet we're able to achieve something that was comparable to the small lot development, but still maintaining our open space and other things that were required of the development. So again, that would still be permissible. But what we might do is look at our R2 and R3 standards once we get a little bit further down the road with some of these other ordinances and how we might improve the standards in those districts.
You know, we had done an initial version where we were going to have that smaller lots than the 5,000, and we'd set up a series of standards. We might want to take a look at that for the condo lots that would result in keeping it in an R2, R3 zone.
Right, but that's not what's before us today. And I think what we might say is that we'll take a look at doing that.
But I mean, that was the original objective.
But what happened to that objective was it got very, very convoluted. And so I'm just going to speak, I think this is elegant and lovely, and it keeps our streetscapes, which is really important. We don't end up with gated communities. We end up with something that people can drive through and live in and possibly even have sidewalks on, and trees in front of their houses. So I think it's absolutely elegant. It's something that we need. I think it will be used, and I think the suggestions that Commissioner Woods and Commissioner Murtzy made to this are really good. And I'd like to see this come back to us. I don't think we need to do much more with this, and I'd like to see it come back to us so that we can act on it and add it to the other two items when we discuss things with council. I think it goes with the PD ordinance.
And if I just wanted to add two things. I think the examples that were provided in the packet are very Orange County, if that's not what we're trying to do. So as we think it through, maybe doing some different ideas. And the other thing just about lot coverage, and I understand architecture and everything, but if we look at Icon, I don't know what, if we took them as small lots, let's just say we took them as that, you know, some of them have little casitas in the back, or they have little cabanas in the back, you know, which is lot coverage. I don't know what the lot coverage of those small lots are, but just an idea as we move forward to think about.
My memory on that was that they didn't like the requirements we wanted to impose when it was going to be a small lot development, which is why they went to a condo where they could do what they wanted to do without our imposing additional requirements. So,
Chair Wormack, are you saying move forward as in the public hearing, the way it was just
I think move forward. My suggestion was we had two suggestions with this. I would think we move forward if you can think of other plans that don't look Orange County. We just wanted to, I think Flynn just wanted to show that we could build something on it. But maybe a floor plan from the neighborhood.
See
They're
if I can
probably
find
too
something.
old, or we couldn't, from the 20s, I'm not sure we could find a sketch or a drawing.
Yeah, it'd be a little difficult.
Fewer garage doors.
Well, there's probably an envelope in the files someplace.
We'll look. We'll look.
In terms of what Commissioner Woods was saying about the garage doors, you know, there's been a lot of developments, Orange County and other places, where they've tried to mitigate that, new urbanism, walk streets, coming in from behind. I haven't seen anything that's totally, I applaud the goal, but if there's something we can come up with that you know, you have a house every 50 feet, and you have a 20-foot wide garage, it's almost by definition you wind up with that. I hope, maybe there's some way around it, but
I think
think about it. Maybe we can modify the code to address that in some way. Maybe the garage door doesn't face the street, it's perpendicular. I don't know, but that would increase the driveway, so all of a sudden you have this huge driveway. I don't know, maybe there's some way to mitigate it.
So I think it's a very good point.
Doesn't do it.
Tandem does it. Can you require tandem?
We could require tandem. I don't know if you want to, Flynn.
Yeah, I would recommend that we keep it flexible, that we offer options for development, such as doing tandem as opposed to the two-car garage.
Just visually, maybe you have two one-car garage doors.
I think there's a variety of ways to do it. The old 1920s where the driveway went along the side of the house and you parked in the back is a way to do it. Another way is maybe tandem or every third unit. I mean, I think there's very creative ways to do it without having it.
There are. It's how do you build it into the ordinance?
We want to, maybe we should consider one-car garages. There are a lot of houses in town that have one-car garages or only carports. If that's what we're trying to do, why do we have?
Well, is there a requirement for covered parking? I thought it was just off-street parking.
There is a requirement for single family that they provide 2 covered parking spaces. That doesn't necessarily mean that both have to be within a garage. It could be a garage and a carport. Or it could just be a carport, but the requirement is for 2 covered spaces. If you would like to look at the option of only requiring one covered space, for example, in the R1E zoning district, that might be appropriate based on the lot size if that's a direction that you'd like to go.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think requiring only one and allowing tandem, you might get. I think we saw someone come in once with a single garage and then a carport in front of it. But I think that might be attractive to require only one.
Especially if you got parking in the street.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Flynn, do you want to think about that? I mean, that's, I think, come back to us, give that some thought and see if that makes sense.
Yeah, what we can do is, again, we'll notice this for a public hearing. I'll come back with the suggested revisions that have already been discussed. And then also as an option, I'll look at just requiring one covered space. And so that way you'll have the option of discussing all of those things together.
Or one and one.
Yep.
It's okay. With that, do we need to make a motion?
No, you do not. This was just a discussion item, so no motion is necessary. I do have your comments, so again, we'll schedule this for a public hearing and come back with a revised draft for you.
Okay, we are at Planning Commission reports, requests, and comments. Do we have any reports?
Not a report, a request.
Please.
Regarding the rock, what is it? Rock Garden project, so-called. Depending on the scope of changes that come back in official form to the approved PDD, I'd like to recommend that we have a study session on it before we consider it.
Yes.
I think it's probably that time of the year, well, maybe the two people at the far end, I don't know, but we do normally have a holiday party for the Planning Commission. And we may want to consider combining it with another party that may be coming up, or that will be coming up for Planning Commission departures, where I think two of us are gone as of the end of the year. So I don't know if we want to combine that, maybe have some discussion whether we want to combine that with a holiday party or make them two separate. I don't have any strong feelings in either, but I'm going to go out of here with a lot of parties.
Is there a Brown Act issue related to parties?
No.
There is not.
Good.
Social ceremonial occasions where no business is being transacted? Okay.
Planning Director's report.
It is with great sadness that I report to you that Mr. Donenfeld has resigned his position on the Planning Commission. We received notice just earlier today before Planning Commission started this afternoon, and I would like to offer my most heartfelt thanks for his service on the Planning Commission, not just this most recent term, but his previous terms that he had also served on Planning Commission, for his thoughtfulness and his deliberations and his fairness in the proceedings that we had here before Planning Commission. He will definitely be missed, and so again, we are very sad to see him go. It would have been at the end of his term here anyway, but still, we're going to miss him very much.
This would be 9.5 years that he's served on the Planning Commission.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine being here even the short time that I have left without him sitting next to me. And I wish him well.
As do we all.
We have a meeting next week.
Yes, we do. We have our regularly scheduled Planning Commission meeting on October the 10th, beginning at 1:30 p.m. here in Council Chambers. We also anticipate that we may have a study session on October the 24th. We'll have more details for you available next week.
And we have a gentleman sitting in the meeting in the staff seats.
My apologies.
Who I don't believe we've been introduced to.
Mr. Peter King, who is our Assistant City Attorney. Peter, if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself. Yes. On microphone, please.
There it goes. So yes, I'm Peter King, and I was hired in May, and so I've been helping Mr. Kotkin with a variety of things. I come here with 25 years experience as a city attorney with the City of Los Angeles, which included stints handling the area planning commissions, the planning commission, a lot of litigation involving land use issues. I was general counsel for a time with the Port of Los Angeles and handled a lot of their CEQA work and litigation. And so I was a jack of all trades, perhaps a master of none, but that's where I've come from. I retired and took some time to visit family and in the New England area, and so now I'm back here and live in the Redlands area and planning to move to this area. So this was a good fit, and I hope I can be of assistance in the future.
Thank you. With that, and if no one has anything else, we are adjourned until Wednesday, October 10th. Thank you all, and thank you to the members of our audience who've stayed with us all these hours.
You can sign up for our fan club.